9. Isaac and Jacob were oddly well-behaved domestic. They straightened the house and talked around the old Ford that Hare had pulled from the swamp. It was behind their garage, a sagging building with stacks of National Geographics in it from a previous tenant. The boys would ask if the house was really theirs, and Dee told them she was pretty sure it was. Her gone husband was bad at details, but he was a good provider, sometimes a flush one. She and the boys could satisfy myriad needs in Big Mart. They straightened the house again. They hunkered in prospect of manhood, waiting on Hare to build the beam and trestle faster. The sun-grayed back of the garage was Hare's drama curtain, they said. He had to tell stories in front of it while he worked, and they sat. They pressed him for tales of other machines and major explosions. Harold Laird stared off as if in conspiracy with other mechanics near the horizon. It was a laboured stare of either profound stupidity or alienation. He had looked constantly in himself for a likeness to his progenitors but failed. His large teeth, big legs and no chest or much rear. Too late, but he had entered the black church up the road and stolen a book from its meek open library called How to Be a Teenager. He gave it to the little ones later, but they discarded it because it was about how to be a nice teenager, which Harold Laird had been. But he had gotten it for himself to see what he had been, and he was going back for how to be a man and wouldn't share it. Laird had hung in the background of his own history. He could not read well and hoped that in the next book there would be pictures of Christian women naked, since he was going to be a husband. Actually, he had once, with others, participated in an event with a woman from Edwards in the bed of a truck, but he was still unsure whether he was manned or not. He was betrothed before to the silhouette of a woman on a bottle of some good-smelling oil of Olay he found but could break it off. She had owned him for years now. He could not leave himself alone, sometimes a sin. The boys' voices were quiet. They were hesitant to laugh or dream or curse. The heat kept up its unsurprising late misery. The mind was brown at the edges, the tongue dry and slow. Dee slept in the weak air conditioning of October. Little Emma beside her was so good that her mother expected her to die any day, as angels were snatched away early to paradise. Once, when Dee had a migraine, the child she now held in sleep massaged her temples the entire night. When Dee opened her eyes at dawn, the child had fallen asleep with her doll's hand on Dee's forehead. Dee wondered if they were born twice as sensitive as normal women. Emma was gone when Dee woke, knowing it was too late to get out of a story she had dreamed. She had few powers, but she was trying. The better part of her was that she liked to heal old people once she knew their pain. She was not a cynical nurse, not at all. She just did not like letting on to her sincerity in front of fools. She could change languages to soothe folks of wild diversity and wants, though her most natural posture was that of the slut paring her nails. In her dream she was chained in a basement with many sex parts that howled on their own. Then she had dreamed she was running up a hill with women, hundreds of them, arms out to what beckoned at the crest. A row of cannons blew down on them, blasted them apart, but they were happy and they sang, like Japanese infantry, exploding into mists of ecstatic nerves. Then they arose and became everything, even the cannons. The hill, the tree, the barn, everything. She woke feeling she could commit suicide this minute with huge happiness because she would leave the world a finished job. She was not sure the meaning of her dream. Without the help of gin, she felt no common sisterhood to women. She also knew she could not leave Emma until the girl was strong and ready. Like the younger boys, but not Spence, who shouldn't even still be home. Thing was, Spence was in love with her own son. He feared the uglier world. Hare was at her door. He was not a bad-looking boy, and he seemed to have acquired more and more manners, even unnecessary ones. Where is everybody, she wondered. They took the baby for a treat, he said. They never do that. We're alone. They cleared the way for me. Us. Of which there isn't any. I have changed since I first saw you. You are beautiful. So beautiful. My thoughts were animal-like, but now I'm like family. We're all in it together. In what? A home. Who are Mummy and Daddy? They could be us. Do I look pitiful? Not at all. Just checking. I'm kind of married. I'm proposing me as husband. 1. I am steady. 2. I am good with my hands. 3. Mortimer is out of the picture. His hands were nice and he could fix things. She studied him across a moat of indifference and time. His throbbing youth softened her. He looked filled now, thicker. Like some boys she knew who had come back from the army. It just seems like you need a home, Harold. I'm already here. My roof. I never saw a girl I needed before I met you. Is it the nurse's outfit? It's everything that gets to me. One day soon you'll look in the mirror and see everything you like about me is over. I'll know the day. You'd be stuck with an old bag of flakes. I'll turn into an outhouse overnight. With heavy lipstick. No. Then you'll know how bad I am. It'll be on my face, every damn story written wrinkles. How can you say those things? Go up to the casino and see. It's where us old party girls go to die and have a club. Sometimes, some just about. Sulky old things with the girl cut out of them. It's not the same with men. Ill stick. Such hope. You're my reason to live. Do you get it? I'm what men remember. I'm not what they need. It's been said to me. What I am is foreign pussy. You didn't mean to be. How do you know? He dropped his head. The long, gentle fingers of his right hand covering his face. Stop playing house, she said. Build what you want on your own. But you're clean. You don't smoke or drink much. They aren't my drugs. Please go on now. I don't care to break your heart. Laird went out onto the front porch, shivering in the warmth, lost between homes. Engorged by despair and desire. He had heard her words as the wail of a kidnapped queen. Unransomed these 2 decades of his spindly life. He thought of the Marines, or the long honest life of an expert mechanic. Both of them seemed chores in hell now. Life was just this, you got a lot of money and you bought things. No other game. You bought her a house, a family. You didn't pull 53-year-old things out of a swamp and fix them. He was angry and small. A gnat. He turned and went inside. She was staring at the blank television. He had no story to put on its screen for her, but he would have her and then tell it. It would begin with an old Ford coupe, red with a gold hood like the boys wanted. He would dump this bucket of rust and just steal the one he'd seen at a junkyard on the south edge of Vicksburg, not well protected. The lot belonged to man Mortimer and a junkman who lived on the premises. To steal Mortimer's trash and make a classic from it would be a story, not just life. Moreover, he knew the junkman, who was a Christian and had cheated or betrayed or connived at no man. The junkman, Pedden, was a Baptist lay preacher, but cars were to him like whiskey to an Indian, his addiction, and they kept him poor. He had preached before to Harold about the naked Bathsheba when King David saw her at her bath and betrayed her husband, Uriah, sending him to the front lines of battle to die so that he could possess her and know her forever. David who had all, Uriah who had nothing but Bathsheba. The story implied to Pedden that Bathsheba had no choice. Who would not lie with the king. Pedden would turn through the Psalms and say he had found the one David wrote to Bathsheba, but that it was too dirty to read to the young. But Spence could get him to read it while Hare stole the coupe right out from under him. If he was successful, God would forgive him, probably. The boys had real power over Dee, Harold Laird knew. She was guilty and served them. Now he was helping them mature. They were becoming, not overnight but steadily more and more, Boy Scouts. The day would come when the couple would stand in the yard, each actor glistening in happiness, the little boys especially. They would have a long talk with her and she would discover the truth that Harold Laird, genius mechanic, body man, paint man, was her future. He could see her in a bridal peignoir with her hidden softnesses all meant for him, but he couldn't think long of this because he hurt himself again and again. John Roman saw Mortimer, looking pale and bent, in the aisle of the bait store. Roman was picking up a beer and pig knuckles and saltines for his lunch. The slab crappie were biting near the spillway. He drove a car this time, wanting to fill a freezer box with this succulence, which Bernice in normal times would broil or fry lightly. Eating didn't get any better. It was so good that many thought the fish was French crap. Sac du lait is its name in Louisiana. Speckled, a frisky white steak swimming. They bite softly, like a suckling child. You take them with minnows and jigs. That was why Roman was in the store. But he was there also in curiosity about Sydney's run of the store since Pepper lost his head. Mortimer made a quick movement past some cans, knocking them over, and didn't bother to set them back, didn't even look back. Roman was fairly sure he was the man with the tongue in the Lexus, but that afternoon was vague. He and Melanie had not spoken since the event. But Sydney in the Lexus was a thing of utter clarity. Even thrown into the rear seat in the black chariot between two sluts and caught and ashamed like some mollusk in the light all of a sudden. Grey hairs on the chest of an oyster. Roman had noticed how sensitive Sydney was to the pain of others. He was not sympathetic, but he was deeply concerned when he heard or saw the hurt, then took its measure against the longest disease of all, his life. He was just alert and, well, hungry for news of his fellows' ills. He began to sort of eat the air and whimper over someone's asthma, scabies, cancer, chest wound. You might make the mistake of thinking he cared, but it was simply an emotive topic and began the peristaltic writhings of his gorge, always about to blow from various bloatage. On the other hand, Roman was sickened by sickness. He watched Sydney behind the cash register standing and watching him back as if he might be a common shoplifter. To his left, in the mouth of another aisle, Mortimer walked out from his own shopping with a sea gaff in his hands. "You know John Roman, mister?" Mortimer Sydney began, strangely formal. "He's a veteran. Wounded. One of our brave ones from the lost battles." "Oh, I've heard. And he dates white women, I've heard. I have knelt on my knees at the graves of such white women. Is your name Ramp?" "No." "John Roman. All right. Guess my name. I know it. You stood 5 feet from me. Death by sea or death by mother. Mort de mer or mort de mre. Merman seaman sea. Did anybody tell you I now own a big piece of this store? John, your feet are walking on my..." Sydney began to protest. "Oh, for pity's sake, sit down, Sydney. I was just going on." Sydney seemed relieved and did sit down on his proprietor's high stool, a swivel chair new to his regime, fairly swank. He immediately jumped up and out in the air, screaming, holding his bottom. He pulled his hands from behind. Tiny points of blood on them. He held 3 or 4 map tacks. Mortimer squalled. He fell for it. Sydney grinned. Who were they? What was this? Roman thought they were like 2 little brothers. Who was leading? Who his stomach turned. He drew off one of the ancient, dusty cellophane white handkerchiefs from a snap display and handed it over the counter to Sydney, who began eating off the wrapper and getting the cloth out with his teeth and fingers. A kid, a not unhappy kid in an old boy prank cute about. Buckwheat Spot Spanky. The other freckled goony-haired one. Alfalfa with centre-parted hair, crossed a lot. These 2 men were brats, that's what they were. They were neighborhood bullies. I took 3 shots to the collar and jaw for them and their recesses. The tall one with rock and roll hair was still holding on to that fish gaff, that shark gaff. What is the verb? The word. They are in collusion. Noun, I guess. Roman walked down the front steps with his new jigs and good minnows. Various geezers, rich among them, were bunched at the base of the steps having at it. What was we looking at? One said. The mother load of weird, said another customer. Ulrich was in a bomber jacket with fleece and it 85. He was real. Bad news with big preacher hair on it. I don't know what that coxcomb was. But this old fist would be his watch out if he chanced to come close to me. That man was crossbred with Lazarus. That cute-up preacher. I seen him before. Said he ain't said word one. Like he talked to a devil. You don't see nothing like that twice. But we did. That old boy in the Edwards football game lavatory. He seen maybe an unclean spirit, like, or trying to exorcise one, like. You hear one day and staggerly cut off your face the next, or your head like pepper. We ain't never finishing talking on that one. Your hotshot sheriff wandering around like a mascot. Ulrich in the moth-eaten bomber jacket, the corduroy trousers much too big now in this skinnier madness, spoke again. Spiders hold the altitude record for earthbound creatures. Mount Everest. He seemed on the verge of tears, then was over it. Up there above the murder of men, these fine little creatures. Their thin legs. Having their families. Those delicate eggs. The winds must howl and howl outside. Roman was sorry he had not gone straight to fishing, but these were fine minnows. He might seine his own, keep a little pool of them behind the house. He headed off to his car. When the fishing was over, he would be glad and sorry both to return home to Bernice. She was suddenly an old sick woman like Harvard's Nita, and he felt just paces behind him, unable to drag her back from the maw of huge nonsense ahead. The spider of Ulrich, he considered abruptly. Wind howling on the jagged mountain top. Their little legs. Shall. Down between them rocks. Icy winds the only weather, only world. Get a hold of something heavy, don't never quit. New babies coming, feel the wind outside their shells already. It born a half-foot from ruin between a rock and another rock. When you knew death was not far off, you always got a strange arrangement of the usual facts. You almost saw the spirit itself. An essence of the familiar shifted. Sound, smell, dirt, sky. 33 years ago, 3 times he had left where a sniper's bullet struck seconds later. Then on a hot afternoon he had known the strangeness but was weary, and he knew now, curious. He had made no move and gotten shot. Roman hummed around the remnants of a tune. Time after time, Chet Baker's version of Airy Sweeter Days. He kept a pistol in his kit for snakes, but he knew he didn't need that much caliber. You live long enough mildly on the lake. That was the plan. Nothing greedy or hungry about it, hardly even a dream. Now some sullen force came in to take away this small existence. No harbor. A small craft cracked against the wall by mean winds. Now he realized he had bought the pistol for men and lied to himself about it. Men in this new newspaper headline shootout even on the school yards. How many niggers drove down a road like this to die 50 or 100 years ago? They'd looked wrong, they'd whistled like wolves, they'd voted. If, say, some fool in a smoke-glass car came up beside him running parallel and wouldn't stop it, kept looking at him, he would pull the gun and fire a magazine through the glass. Death worked on Bernice at home. Here, whoever, here's some for you too. He had changed and hated his changes. Pastor Egan lay silent. The other patient was watching a television show about a hospital as he lay there in the hospital. Maybe he wasn't convinced enough he was truly here. Egan knew better. His inner voice had just returned and he liked himself again. Episcopals, your rituals are babble, it muttered. Robed baboonery. Lukewarm, I spit them from my mouth, even while loving them and their gold and whiskey and cable-knit sportswear. You are post-war, postmodern, posthuman. You sweep up his all. The waste of the stores and storerooms find their place in each consumer heart to rot and reek. You are lukewarm, my people, my people. No decisiveness. Safe either pastor. The man who owes thousands to the pimp who butchered him. Something large is in the woods. Not what you planned. You have not decided, so the thing in the woods is deciding. 10. In the pawnshop where the saxophone rested in its velvet-lined dark alligator case, Max Raymond had not been as misled as he supposed. His nemesis Malcolm, the afflicted past lover of Mimi Suarez, had gone by the window. He knew where Raymond was and intended to have a showdown with him, but was in no way connected to the Red Mercury sable. He was looking for a weapon, probably a 12-gauge double, when he missed the pawnshop and was led on by another rank of pawnshop signs down the way. Head turned into an alley by mistake, tired from hitchhiking down Highway 61. 7 different rides and a grinding wait in all weathers, October going hot, cold, rainy and balmy, freezing. He could not drive, and his old gang did not approve of his pilgrimage. Malcolm walked out of the mouth of the alley after Raymond had followed the car. Had he bought fast and, leaving Raymond dead behind him, taken the man's car, he would have arrived at the house with me Monsieur as away visiting relatives and singing in Miami. Neither he nor Raymond had seen the other, but they never lived a day without the other on their minds. In the next pawnshop was a more comprehensive collection of guns, and in this state of enormous sympathy for gun owner and hunter, where the legislature has even designated a specified season for dwarfs to hunt deer with crossbow, he found sympathy surrounding him on all sides. The pawnshop owner wanted victims armed for whatever. In the shop were the 10 whores and many bigger, meaner orphans and the now 15-year-old girls. It was not just a summer camp anymore. It was also less announced what it was now. They were not survivalists, nor religionists, nor paramilitary exactly. They needed guns, ammo, water and canned goods, barbed wire, and already had dynamite and 4 live grenades from the National Guard. The percussion kind, which they needed more of. You could add shrapnel to the outside of these very easily in the shop. The couple and the others liked Malcolm instantly, and they had a much better gun for him. He left with them, he who was skimping on food to buy the 12 gorge. Carl, Bob and Ulrich imagined they had a temporary grand theft going when they started up the notorious pontoon launch that Harvard had conceived and largely built for Melanie Wooten, and sailed it directly across the lake to preach to the orphans. But it was part Ulrich's already by original charter, and the keys stayed in it all the time. The men were senile, sometimes raving and unkempt, but Ulrich had handled the launch several times before, and he did pilot well and knew the lake better than Harvard. Also he had no fear of water, although he would forget whether he could swim or not. Carl Bob Feeney simply couldn't. He wore a fair barrel of life-preserving with 2 jackets, one in front, the other on his back. You couldn't have held him under with a semi-wheel rim and chains. They ploughed. This vessel required patience, although the Mercuries were powerful and magnificent. Patience and meditation were what it was all about. They had brought their own sermonettes to read when the orphans got aboard. Ulrich would talk about the white teeth of animals, especially those of the lesser creatures. The travelling was perfect in late October, the sky orange-violet at mid-afternoon. The trees along the shore were still green, but a few were on fire in that incandescence born of lush summers, fat-sopping roots. "Forgive us, little children," he rehearsed, he prayed. "Our long years on this earth are an obscenity." They carried pictures of McJordan, the Jackson policeman notorious for shooting 2 smallish dogs with a red X across his face. They had had it done at a laser print in Vicksburg owned by an angry animal lover. Ulrich wished he could sing, write songs and sing, but mainly just sing. So much so long in his bosom that could have been shared and vented to his auditors through the years. They would have liked him instead of fleeing. He wished he could sing all out in a long exquisite howl for the animals and flight, but he was just croaking here and taking a nose hit now and then from his oxygen bottle. He had heard a story of a man, Roy Orbison, who sang so beautifully that he turned permanently pale. He wore nothing but black and dark sunglasses to memorialize his grief over his wife and children dying in a fire. That was a wonderful fate, thought Ulrich. He wanted to be pale and a bird with a deep throat. The animals would elect him their tongue. "We will have a ceremony in gratitude to the animals, and then I'll kill myself," he decided. Carl Bob Feeney bore straight ahead with his stare at the far shore, trying to piece together any orphans' tableau on their pier that might be ready for them. He could not see well, though, and he was looking at a crowd of heifers with buzzards over them and trying to figure. Carl Bob loved the launch as his an almost bold late gift to his years on the land with his dogs and cats. Loved his nephew, Byron Egan, a prince of the spirit, a boon relative. Blessed his sister, Egan's mother, for providing him against this darkness. Sometimes old Feeney forgot he was not still a devoted Roman Catholic, and sometimes he felt he was a whole torn country, afire in all quadrants. A greyhound, alert to kindness, stood next to Melanie on the pier. It was a gift from Faisto. They had come out after loving and discovered the two ancient loonies had taken the launch. They called Harvard, and he was a little concerned but said gruffly that he did not care to come down to the pier if the sheriff was there. He told Melanie, she thought bitterly, that it was consuming all his care to watch his beloved wife of all these years slowly slipping away. He had begged her not to smoke, to exercise, to eat better. So here they had the results of another individual, fully warned, taking her own road in mild spite against the odds in the newspapers. Betting on Harvard University upsetting Alabama in football. Oh, to be holding her hand again when they were 23, Melanie said. That sounded right, and it made her cry. She hung up the phone, bereft, and held in the sheriff's arms at the same time. She had never disgusted anyone before. In their haste to renounce Melanie, the pier crowd did not notice that the cheerleader looked better than she had since middle age. The evidence was that she was reclaiming middle age right now, however briefly, and enjoying it backwards. A smile on some old women does not become them, and they look macabre in their glee. Not so Mrs. Wooten. She was backlit, it seemed, into severe blonde on a blue field. She had admirable teeth, for one thing. But the sheriff was drawn and baged, more like a throttled immigrant at the turn of the century than the video lecturer. Some did now mock him for his race. They weren't used to Sicilians except around the Gulf Coast, and he was noted as maffeared by several older viewers as well as lying fool for his failures to indict or even locate the killer of Pepper Fart and the butcherer of Frank Booth and Pastor Byron Egan. These people did not fear his wrath or respect his office. Sheriff Faisto despised being unpopular too. For the main part he had acted himself into this job and had intended to grow rapidly in office. Melanie and Faisto. Love and despair go hand in hand. Sleep in the same bed. In full light she was not confident of herself, but she could not know Faisto was gone in love for her much deeper than appearances. The love was ruining him. He slept with her soul and never got enough of it. What lines bred Melanie they ought to store the blood in a safe. He was twice in love with her just for lasting. She studied the large bent dog. Its face made her think of T.S. Eliot's famous line, some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. It was an emeritus of the tracks in West Memphis, where Deputy Bernard had confiscated it from a man who had abused it. For Faisto, the greyhound stood for something. What else could comfort this startling creature better than another startling creature, with eyes haunted as if alarmed by its own creation? He gave it to be there in his absence from her. When I come back, I want you to have named our dog. We don't know it. You'll be at the door of your house and tell me the name, and then drop your gown and I'll get on my knees. Sweet man. He thought he knew his killer now, and Cutter too. It was long quiet work, but he would have him soon. Bernard had seen something and a church trombonist had seen something. But Faisto's memory of their last acts was driving him around the bend, riding his Melanie to the tune of Sorcerer's Apprentice on the stereo in the next room. She was taken by several supreme moments, a happy crisis she did not know as a possibility. She was sad after the outflow and wept deeply in gratitude. He said he needed to bring her home good news and wouldn't return until he did. Then he was gone. Melanie was very weary of what regular people thought. Their thoughts began to hurt and make her weak. Come, let me be your grandmother Harwood, or whatever it is called. Let me be the source of dissension. I never knew Ben Harvard loved me. But fine, let me serve as not only sin but evil around here. I meant to be a scandal all along. Add me to all the hauntings and chaos and lunacy. I am so tired of these old jaws cracking about it. She went back into the house. For his own pain, Dr. Harvard decided to come down to the pier and see Melanie by accident in his mission of concern about Ulrich and Feeney at large on the barge. Others had gathered when word got out they might be in trouble or lost. Wren Lewis, the dog's son, who frightened the greyhound back indoors, John Roman and the pale and butchered Egan gathered at the end of the pier. Then Sidney dragged down from his Batestar duties, making a show of anger about his lost trade. Nobody remembered who'd called him. He was off on a mad consumer's ride, a revenge against lost time and missed women, fun, dice, fine liquor. His language was tougher, glibber than his old talk. Nobody knew quite who he was now. He emulated Man Mortimer, who was changing gravely himself. They could see tiny specks of life across the lake, but no boat. They spoke of the boat as if it were at the bottom of the lake, and the old men bobbing and yammering in their life jackets. And what each had planned to read next, meditation way up the reservoir near Yazoo, Indian word for death ghost, was it. Sidney reminded Harvard of all the artistic and nautical effort he had put in the project. Forget the pile of money, which nobody else here had combined. All for Miss Melanie too. We know that. A grand boat for a grand swank, love, wasn't it? And your poor wife dying at home all the while, smoking them cigarettes and building up her sad neglected ass with chocolate. You are scum, said Harvard. All agreed the sheriff was a strange dumb thing about these troubles. That he was just another fraud of locality like Bill Clinton. The law was fast cars with whip and Tenny racing around from one unsolved atrocity to another, screaming radios. Shield on the door to read late, Lardas, last to know. But expert marksmen on small dogs roughing in a driveway, or puffed actors in dinner theatre, a fit of exhibitionism. Your tax is at work. Then they spoke of Melanie. There'll come the day when it's right, Harvard. You'll propose marriage, she'll accept. The two of you were made for each other. Get married on the barge by Parson Egan here, Louis said. Egan watched the water east and west. He had not uttered a word, and he was ashamed of his carved face, the cross in stitched pieces. If you don't care, old sheriff boy, been at a pinit, said Sidney happily. Please. Harvard had found his own small voice at last. The two of 'em come round, why you can smell it on 'em, Sidney insisted. You're a wretched man, if not evil, cried tall Louis. Not no worse than the truth. Yeah, she got her glass animals and her books and music, and now her lawman. She a complete woman. Harvard turned and walked up the hill, in grief, they presumed. John Roman was about to reveal Sidney's late career between the whores. He liked and admired Harvard tremendously. But then Wren spoke again, hopeful that the lying he had done about Wake Island was forgotten. You had to move your mouth and break the best heart here. He stepped forward and slapped Sidney across the face. His arm was long and he still had surprising power in it. It was not an idle blow. Sidney sat right down on the beach grass. It seemed Wren was not through, and John Roman moved up to restrain him. But you thought he might be wanting a piece of Sidney too. Everybody did. Sidney, huddled down, delirious in spite, was glad to see that in their unhappiness the others now turned on each other. John Roman got Wren in a half Nelson and started dragging him away from Sidney. Louis kicked at Sidney's face, missed, came again. Sidney took a blow right into the heaving place and began rowing and firing projectile vomit. Got some on the poor stitched Frankensteinish Byron Egan, who was attempting to intervene. Some pranced around, barking and wagging his tail. Across the lake they heard at an immense distance what sounded like serial gunfire and turned. All this while, Egan, silent about his attacker, pleaded for the flock to return to itself. Ulrich and Feeney approached the pier and slowed, observing the etiquette of the small wake. They were doing fine, nothing going over had been senile or forgetful. It was just that Ulrich was relying on Feeney for a bit of navigation, and Feeney didn't see right, nor did he acknowledge this to himself, so he had taken them out of their way a bit. Now he thought he saw a sail come up on the pier, and a boat hoisted by its small crew. What was happening was that armed children were making a barricade on the end of the pier at the behest of the camp founders, Jean and Penny Ten Haw. The couple was armed too. They did not expect the oncoming barge to be armed, but they guessed Mortimer might be aboard and intended to deliver a volley that would part the man 15 ways. They had made a flag, orange, black and white, with the letters OS in black. They called themselves Oasis, Orphans Against Smiling Strangers. a slogan stitched on it. We have already lost, so we will win. We shall lose many, we shall kill few. The one we kill, smiling stranger, will be you. The changes were inspired by the awful revelations of the 15-year-old girls. Man Mortimer thought he had charmed them and sent them back to recruit fresher younger subjects for his new video company. But Sandra, the little one, had been injured by Large Lloyd, who had grown angry and impatient in his work and felt ludicrous in a cape and mask. They intended to kill Mortimer, and Lloyd too, and Eddie, Bertha, and especially Marcin, who was hardly older than the camp girls and helped betray them. Both ruined for life by intimacies distributed widely as underground art. Minnie and Sandra had turned on Mortimer when he explained over the telephone, with compassion and sweetness. He thought that they were too old now for his projects. One day he promised he would take them away and set them up in fine style. But day after day, Mortimer failed to show. Then came the day when they exposed him for what he was. They did not say how glad they had been to participate, but they mentioned drugs, blackmail, and death threats that had never occurred. Jean and Penny were in violent sympathy with hurt children. A new spirit took over. They would not assassinate outside the camp fence, but anybody from outside who entered the grounds. Well, the new spirit was on the end of the pier behind a canoe. They began to string razor wire from the cab of a pickup, but several were cut and the going was slow. They glued glass onto percussion grenades with crazy glue. Many a little one glued the grenade to his palm too. No discussion. No trust in the laws of men. Death to smiling strangers on the spot. Death by long overdue higher law. Both girls now knelt behind the canoe barricade with 7 others, all taking aim not on the man in the wheelhouse but on the one standing and trying to unblur his impressions, Carl Bob Feeney. Minnie, the girl with breasts, had the honor of handling a Winchester lever-action .3030 with hollow-point bullets. A telescope for sighting. She had known for a long time that Mortimer was not aboard, but Feeney looked a good deal like her second stepfather in Galveston, Texas. A rich performed a slow turn about 50 yards out in a hail of lead. The pleasure boat was riddled, its windshield and stained glass cabin windows shattered. Only the ineptness of the orphans' rifle training was on their side. Outside of real estate, the 10 whores had no talents, though they presumed to emit rays of instruction by simply riding horses and setting a good example. Minnie fired over and over at Feeney through the telescope and must have carved his outline in blue space around him. Somebody threw 2 grenades. Thumping, pumping geysers and minnow kill out of 12 feet of clear green water. The barge was on the way back at full throttle. Twin Mercuries churning all out. Ulrich must have caught up to the point where most of the bullets and buckshot were going in their error, for the back of the right stern disappeared and smoke crept up. After a year, it felt to Feeney and Ulrich, they were out of range. In another place and time they would have been commended to some award. Soon they were pretty well afire back there, but making good time to Fart Cove. The 10 whores stood arm in arm behind the firing line, hating the vehicle that might have brought another man Mortimer to their shores. An armed Carl Bob Feeney would have shot down the both of them. The Oasis flag still flew on its pole at the front of the barricade. The couple considered this a victory, and they celebrated with hot dogs and a long movie that night. Outside, older orphans patrolled the fence and beefed up sections of unrolled barbed wire. Rifles slung on a rope across their backs. They gathered around the campfire for chats. An unwise salvo, bad military instruction. But there had been army error everywhere. A tradition carried on apace. The pier crowd watched as Ulrich brought the barge over across the lake. There was a fire in the stern near the gas tanks. Saner men would have jumped overboard 5 minutes ago, but not these pilgrims. They ploughed, they felt the power drop back to a single mercury, they felt orange and hot on their backs. One of the tanks seemed a wall of flames and threatened to explode the next tank. It will blow, it will immolate, it will soon be over, Ulrich thought. Not a bad thing, as I am ready to go to the dead animals in that other world and spend my next life atoning. Carl Bob Feeney alongside. This is the hell never described, where you get a second chance to correct your miserable life by daily ministry to those you harmed or made dead. Perhaps these are the reincarnated ones, the saints we still have scattered among us. Hitler and Stalin working as good men in obscurity somewhere. And Mao, who never took a bath except in the organs of his young lovers, as he put it, and who murdered even the sparrows of the air to bring a pestilence of grasshoppers. Feeney and I will recognize them, workers in the vineyard. Feeney would have been long gone in his double life jacket except he feared water so much and thought it capable of melting off the buckles. All deeper water to Feeney was a sucking vortex activated by contact with any warm thing that thrashed. Then there were the sharks. Great fat blonde lake sharks that lay on the bottom until stirred by that music above, men flapping, kicking their legs, yelling for help. "We'll have to run her aground near the pier and call for help," said Ulrich. "Friend, there is no help here. Try to make the shallows out of the shark beds." "Feeney, you're an old priest from Ireland. There are no sharks. Leave it to me. I know nature this was a lie." All considered, Feeney thought, those children blazing away were very charitable. They might have killed us easily instead of this warning. We could have been the church, the state or landlords, preachers and destroyers. They neared the pier, jumped down from a fully engulfed floor of the bow and cabin. The pleasure barge was a collapsed charcoal hulk by the time Melanie got the Redwood Fire Department there. No obvious evidence of foul play, only the vague idiocy of two old fools. Ulrich and Feeney never mentioned they were fired upon and took the abuse with equanimity. Nevertheless, sane fishermen avoided fishing the weeds and lily pads of the orphans' camp shoreline. All that rifle range going, you might get into something stray. Sidney was back at the bait store when he got word and almost wrecked his fine car several times racing over, wallowing on gravel and twisting on grass, fish-stealing. With water on the road he would have hydroplaned. Then he limped wildly down the hill where others gathered. Ulrich had done this trying to light a cigarette aft near the gasoline, he was told. One more chance before they hauled him and Feeney to almost there. Sidney Fart was in ecstasy. Sheriff Faisto had a lead. The last to see Pepper alive seemed to have been Ruthna, a somewhat notorious woman, and two men called Harb and Alexander. The sheriff had tracked them to the tame and brick-streeted town of Clinton, where the Baptist College was, and where Grant had once stabled his horses in a chapel in the midst of giant cedars. Now its suburbs defined it. Pine forests ripped down for the blocky bunkers of new businessmen and computer Christians fleeing the blacker Jetson to the east. The sheriff met all three in Ruthna's ragged house, an ersatz hacienda with failing cactuses and yuccas about. It was the home of her fifth husband, Harb, who was her ex but still came around to visit with Alexander over a bottle or two now and then. They were friends of Max Raymond and did see Pepper a few minutes before 10 that night. But they were depressed and godless, divorced and alcoholic, and their memories were random. Once they were not suspects, they began to be drunk and pathetic in a short space, fighting for narrative time with each other. The sheriff was sorting, writing, reacting. Then he just asked them to shut up. The night in question they had gnawed bones in a booth of the Northside restaurant near Enough Food, far superior to the restaurant right at the saxophonist and singer's cottage. Raw beams, linoleum, spiderweb formica tabletops, leatherette seats, happy waitresses. A theme. A waitress hurried out and dumped ribs on a heavy paper tablecloth, 2 rolls of paper napkins. They wanted to be higher when they left to visit Raymond and the Coyote. They considered themselves urbanites, ignorant of philosophy but crammed with half-remembered songs which served. They were unhappy, and if God existed, they blamed him for much. The whiskey still worked on them, but they needed more. Ruthna pulled the Jeep Grand Cherokee Laredo into the gravel lot of the bait store for a last beer. At least ice and cups and tums. The ribs of Near Enough Food were loggy and scalding in their tender stomachs. Harb and Ruthna had already begun to fight regarding her past. Alexander went inside and left them to it. A hound watched them all from the porch. Soon enough the fight grew tiresome. They passed a man on a high stool, a note written on an envelope on the counter before him. He was asleep. A football was in the aisle of the store, and this was a curious thing, as if somebody had just left off a game of touch. They had a sense somebody was in the back but just left this old man to his sleeping. He was a dry white old creature, leaning on the bulwark of a Lucky Strike display case in which all brands of smokes were stacked. Old Camels, Chesterfields, Pall Malls and Royton cigars, brands that seldom moved in modern towns. The note under his fingers must be a message to customers, they figured. Out to lunch or the like, even though he was there. They got the sack of ice, the plastic cups, the soda, lemons. For a geezer he was well stocked in the needs of the drinking life. Maybe he was deaf as well as asleep. They couldn't get his attention. Alexander turned the note around, thinking maybe to wake him. The note seemed oddly personal but scrawled in excitement or carelessness. I seen the light around the corner of the tunnel, them bastards waiting for me. His face was perhaps more purple than was good for a fellow. But he could damn well sleep, and they decided this was quaint, and in their sleepless tossings they envied him. They grabbed a bottle from the shelf behind him and went out with the goods, pocketing the cash. They thought this was what the sheriff had come about, and this they apologized for. The drink, the weirdness of the scene, their lightness of spirit. Really, it was only a prank. They continued a bit just to hear for themselves what happened the rest of the night once they got to Match Raymond's. They told Raymond about the catatonic man. Old Pepper harked back to Raymond's adolescence, his first night here in a cabin with other boys. The rare night it snowed here. A January with only a few crappy fishermen around. Somebody had insisted Pepper look out at the snow falling thickly in the porch light. He went out, peered briefly and returned. Nasty, he said. Nothing else. Raymond insisted this was modern poetry. Two thought Raymond was affected. Another fight broke out. He and the coyote had been drinking too. She told him the way he clung to his past was morbid. He accused her of having no memories. Fort Lauderdale, Memphis. What was that? She was nowhere, just tits and hair with a voice. The others took her side. Mimi Suarez said she was not pregnant and was glad. After a while Alexander and Harb insisted Mimi sing, for song was what was left in the world. Rutha felt her powers waning and began taking off her clothes. She went out to the back stoop like that and thought she heard booze from nature, and her feelings were hurt. She came in and the coyote passed her and began singing out there with her back to them. Raymond passed the naked Ruthna, dancing. Harb was swaying before her in boxer shorts and black shoes. Alexander watched Mimi's back as she faced the swamp and sang. Presently Raymond accompanied her on the sax. Then he tore her dress off. Raymond and the weak porch light on Mimi's shoulders and buttocks. Out there kneeling and spying, Spons, Harold and the little ones were at pains to keep their faces behind the fronds. Mimi was the first woman Harold had seen naked. He looked straight through her as through a lens to his beloved Dee. This woman was not his stopping place, pretty as her voice was, strange as his vantage. The younger boys stayed close to the skeletons. I've got more confidence. I'm not scared of Melody anymore, they heard Raymond call to the others. Nobody cared. The guests lumbered about the rooms in a great sweat, dancing, one nude, wishing themselves lost from their species. 11. Carl Bob Feeney was dead, the sheriff learned, arriving at the mortuary in Vicksburg. Feeney's nephew had identified the body, but he was not here now. Loved ones do not linger in these precincts. Only the women who sought Christ in the tomb to pay their respects and discovered the resurrection announced by a frightening young man in all-white garments. Perhaps the writer of the Gospel, Mark himself, who had fled the law and run naked out of this garment one night long ago at Gethsemane. But Feister was not here about Feeney. The mortuary staff had called him with a problem. It was after 9, but lights were on in the basement. A man had been telephoning them at regular intervals, then random ones, about the embalming of an Uncle Ricky who was not there in any form. Yet the caller insisted they save Uncle Ricky's head to be arrested. Who would arrest him? The mortuary director asked him, the caller. Sheriff Faisto, said the caller. He knows this case. Uncle Ricky put his cigarette out on his forehead for 20 years and now his head needed to be arrested. The calls became harassing and then stopped, but they threatened the mortuary and the sheriff both if Uncle Ricky's head did not stand trial alone. It must not go underground or into cremation. Have mercy on these people who see the living become a thing, thought the sheriff. Look here, said the dead, I'm going now, but I'll leave you this grey meat to lug around a few hours more. No matter what rattlesnakes the dead were, the living had to salute the leavings. All must submit. He thought of his father, a small savage marine, proud of his dry heart. The old soldiers around his grave, lying through their teeth. Oh, he was the salt of the earth, a man's man. His mother a tall beauty desiccated and driven nearly mute by his company. Like an old television antenna finally, obsolete decades ago. The man at the car door surprised Faisto. He was already scared. Sheriff Faisto. You called. Oh yes, Sheriff. This is about the telephone calls. Uncle Ricky and all that. Yeah, he called again just now. What was the cause of death on Feeney, by the way? A coronary, I think. He had very bad lungs. His nephew said he had become a chain smoker since leaving the Catholic Church. He was once a priest. He had other diseases. But Lord, he was 82. He came from Ireland and was a missionary to Mississippi. My wife informed me this was a third world mission field to Irish Catholics. Ireland. All their broods and terrorists. Well, anyway, we wondered if you could put a trace or stop the calls. This isn't my county. I don't know who's calling, either, or I'd act on it. Sorry, friend. Faisto drove off. He felt pulled by dread to nowhere. Had never even gotten out of his car and had spoken only through the window. He might wobble if he walks, or thrust headlong like a swimmer through this fog. Next week he was on stage again in a production of the Vicksburg Theatre League. Now he couldn't remember who he was playing or what he spoke. He acknowledged he was a fearful man, but why had this Uncle Ricky call shaken him so much? Horrible laughter and Faisto's ruin were in the voice over the phone. That spectre every man might feel at his shoulder. You would turn, and here was the shape and face, the awful laughter, the thing pointing at you. It knew who you were and had caught up with you at last. It had seen you faring back and forth in that old woman, hot Granny, pulling a long one out of Granny, hiding her false teeth. He needed sleep. He needed to be out of love. He felt he reigned in a county which everyone of worth should have left decades ago, all breeds. He dealt with refuse, squatters, the ones gathered around their own nastiness, their own echoes, like night dogs. Max Raymond returned to the church in the glen where Egan had beat his fists, demonstrated his hypodermic, tossed his ponytail. It was empty but open, and he walked to the pinewood altar. All was poignant since Egan's uncle had died and Egan's face had been mutilated. Egan still refused to name the mutilator. Raymond remained silent as well, the bones, his disgrace, the stab wound which still throbbed in his buttock when he walked or played the sax or even stood too long. Rain hit on the tin roof. Early shots from the pickets before main engagement. The rain pleased Raymond immensely, as it always did. It whispered, cancel your duty to the outer, get fetal, think of caves. He had loved it at Tulane, where he went to school forever, it seemed. Rain out of Texas and the Gulf. Twilight now, the last of radiant heat sweeping out in the new breezes under the cracked windows with their purple and green glass. Last swirls of color before you drowned, maybe. You could imagine yourself purified by them, you wanted it. Clear this mess, Lord. Save me while you're at it. Raymond waited and then picked up a hymnal. The altar was lit by a single bulb in a reading lamp. He was about to tear out a page and leave a message to Byron Egan. Outside, a car crunched alongside the church on the pea gravel. He went to the window and saw two boys in an amazing automobile, a 1948 Ford Coupe in deep red with a gold hood. The driver could barely see over the panel. The driver did not cut off the engine. The car pushed out a considerable white cloud from the rear, perhaps blown or crippled by a brake. But the thing kept throbbing. The boys seemed to have been stolen by it and made to do its will. Well, if you can shoot and drive at 10, then it's still the South, Raymond thought. He raised the window and leaned out as Egan had done many nights ago and lost his face. Are you the preacher? Asked the boy behind the wheel. No. Are you his friend? I think so. Tell him we wanted him to do this thing right. We gone to have some fun. Might even shoot somebody if we can get him to follow us. We think he seen us and took the bait all right. Stop the car and come in. Don't be rash or dumb now. We carryin' his own pistol. Mortimer's. That's what I mean. No reason to make more trouble. You think the preacher'll be back soon? I imagine. It's Wednesday night. Prayer meeting. You know any other preachers that smoke cigarettes, mister? No, I don't, not right off. That's why we chose him. We like him. But we gonna come back when we see his car here with yours. They were underage, undersized, underfed even. But in the vehicle they had dignity, and you did not think of children but grim little men. Wild smoke out the back, and the two meager heads pledged to this red and golden absurdity. A casino roundup car. They drove off very solemnly with the badge shifting. The car lurched from its own colors, then went smoother in the third gear. He waited for the preacher a while longer. Maybe there was no prayer meeting here, or cancelled while Egan was mourning for his Uncle Feeney. Yet man, Mortimer might be close to the boys. Raymond could stand being a coward only just a little bit longer. He left. When the preacher did come a half-hour later, there was a pile of crushed bones on the top step of the church porch. He knew at once what they were. He had money in his pocket for an installment on his loan. Mortimer did not need to go voodoo on him, but the man was apparently enjoying the reach of his evil now. Rushing into symbols, always a sign of some disorder, decided the preacher, much reformed since those years of the Maltese crosses and crossbones of the bikers. He wanted to ride, to drink, to smoke. He had started smoking again several weeks back. Nobody liked it, and he tended to hide his butts like a schoolboy would. In trees, rest rooms, the cup of his hand. Egan was not too mournful. Taking Uncle Carl bobbed onward would have been sadder. Now he had a surplus of money, really, a home, dogs, cats, land. 2 priests had attended the small funeral in Vicksburg. They were nice gentlemen, fond of Brother Carolus Robert still. This helped Egan's heart. Had come to sweep the church and check the space heaters and radiators because the cold was on. But he would preach if any showed. The rain chill lay in him still. The heaters were old donated units, probably illegal. The clay grates red with heat. They ran off a propane tank behind the little church. He liked them because you saw immediate hell in them. Hell was loose in the world and it had its colors. Beings came up from its reaches in a reverse resurrection and got among what righteous flocks remained. He knew he had no more life span than a dog's left to him, and his face might ruin his chances for marriage, but he would bring a righteous posse into this fight beginning tonight with even 1 sheep. These bones were merely death, reminders there was only one road and the road never changed. They were only the last litter of life. Perhaps his methadone run 7 years back was meant to show him this. Here they were where they belonged. He might preach about them, or lacquer them for display in the chapel, carrying them with him to his other ministries. He did not quite understand yet his duty to them, but on the other hand he had not known what day would follow the next since he surrendered himself to the Lord Jesus Christ. Serving his Lord had been a joy and not insanity at all. It was joy even when none listened, even when he was cursed for a Christa in the casino aisles. When the right triumphed, Egan knew they would build cancer centers and Christian motorcycle repair shops and bookstores and even colleges from the casino buildings. He was not waiting. He knew there were others of the same mind. They would see the tails of the godforsaken backing out the greasy way they came in. Donald Trump, Harrows, whoever thought they were at home here? He had heard Russian mafia too. Wherever it went, you knew the money was siphoned off to out of state, out of Grace Pigs somewhere, not into an education fund for small children as they boasted. And Lord, he whispered, I know these counties better than any living man. I rolled in sin in every quarter, every dark province. Even Moses wandered in the desert 40 years. To compensate for former lost years in narcotics, I have been blessed. Like many another reformed smoker, he had returned to the habit twofold. He smoked incessantly and drank nearly a gallon of thick coffee every day. Because the minister smoked openly, he could not have a denomination, only a flock. He knew smoking was wrong, he was weak. He was positive the Lord frowned on it. Some things were sin and others just math. You smoked a number of cigarettes and then you got ill. You watched television a number of times and then you were television, empty until turned on again. The casino was math become a monster. But even with wrestling and prayer, even tears and spasms into the wee hours, he could not quit cigarettes. Maybe a sign to the weak ones they would be let in and forgiven too. He felt sin more deeply than the rest because he had seen it from its early infant sleep. And bliss too, the bliss of relief from his sour burdens. A bliss next to flight itself. Dear old Ulrich, Egan had tried to tell him this, but the warrior soul of the man was still angry about Feeney, his pal, and sad past words. Egan and Ulrich sat long on the end of the pier watching the ring of red around a cold moon. Ulrich told him he must love the animals even more and help them. Yet Egan thought the heart could stand only so much concern. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, no more. He took the broom and began sweeping in the pale glow of the altar lamp. He did not want lights overhead yet. He wanted silence and shadows and the rain outside on the roof for a while. Then he found the torn page with the note on the altar. I am your servant, call Max Raymond. The number beneath it. Egan had seen Max Raymond and his band, especially the wife, performing in a casino where he had once dearly loved to gamble, and walked trembling past the tables still, his pockets full of stiff little cards. John 3:16 on one side, you are in hell on the other. Quietly handing them out to the annoyed and angry, some frightened by his cheek tattoo. When he came into the music hall through which Cuban jazz was throbbing, he saw there were not many revelers at the tables. Few dancers. He saw the coyote on stage, curved around the microphone like an old tortoise, and straightway coveted her, sailing into fantasies so sweet they seemed beyond heaven or hell. He whispered his thanks for her existence, then departed quietly. But he asked questions later, came back to the casino, his ministry bent somewhat to the earthly appreciation of Mimi Suarez. Who was the husband with such luck? He saw him, heard him play the horn, and could not understand. In the church he turned on the overhead fluorescent bar. He continued sweeping into the corners, invigorated by the cool draughts. For all his philosophy he avoided looking at the pile of bone shards on the porch. Then a voice called from outside. The man was still in his car, leaning out. Byron Egan stood on the threshold. Oh, Pastor, is that you, Raymond? No, no. Are you with the Bones? I am related to the Bones. A bent man stepped from the car and stood at the bottom of the steps. He seemed unmindful of the mist on his face. Egan recognized Mortimer. What are you wanting? He asked, shaking, holding the broom. Oh, my money, but no idea after that really. I just seem to want to go a lot of places, said Mortimer. Egan dropped the broom and whipped out a great switchblade, nearly a bowie, from the hip of his jeans. The blade jumped out with a loud click and lock. He waved it beneath the porch light. Why, Pastor, I been sick. I know not what I do. What could have happened to your face? I could see you now 100 yards off. I lived in sin and age, and I know you well. You look a devil yourself. Like you in some far pirate tribe. Old Bert Lancaster swinging from the ropes on a boat. but they are doing not a half bad job on it. I am the Lord's servant branded, in taking these old scraps of bone off with me, but they might be employed again, in getting to be the caretaker of these slivers, looking for the owner. Get out of here. You're the black seed itself. Egan thrust the money at Mortimer, who gathered up the bone sticks haphazardly, dropping pieces, unmindful. Then he got in the car and went. In this life, last things are never said, nor can they be. The preacher pocketed the knife. His knees were weak, his neck stiff. He was certain the Lord moved in his fingers and did not understand this fear or even the words he had just uttered. He thought he heard a crackling or a sigh just outside the south window, and he watched out for what glistened in the mist. He listened for the living sigh of evil, if it was bigger now. Echoes from the casino were all he heard. Then Ulrich's old woody wagon rolled up to the church, glistening, both ancient and new, phantom of a heavy past, but joy manufactured right into it. First Ulrich climbed out slowly, then on the other side Max Raymond. Egan was very happy. We've come to worship, to discuss, to live, said Raymond, somewhat practiced, Egan thought. I'm scared, I'm alone. I've come to ask you to let me move in with you and the dogs. It'll be no bother. I must be close to Feeney's dogs. I'll clean and watch the house for you, said Ulrich. Egan did not doubt he was given two miracles. He loved the old man. The man needed him. The dogs needed Ulrich, even with his oxygen and nose tube. The man who had once flown and dreamed himself away all his life afterward. Egan himself was suddenly wrapped twice by a high lonesome and a circle of fear. But this night was good. The wine of gentle conversation, other like spirits directly near to hand in the nights. Good, good. The old friendly strength came back to him. I want revenge, said Max Raymond. I'm a dog myself, the dog of a zombie. Come in, come in. What we have is one old sinner out there trying to be legion. He doesn't even trust his help anymore. He is nearing his breakdown. He took my money and drove away muttering, afraid of my knife. You are an armed Christian, asked Raymond. I believe the Lord approves if they get you in the face. And no little slap on the cheek. I don't think the Lord is training any knife bait no more. He called my home and offered my wife a job as Queen of Whores if her performance with him was sufficient, said Raymond. Said she needed breaking in a little and English lessons. Cubanismo got to have it, read the flyer. The band blared and chopped along, aroused by itself, uncertain of ever descending. The weekend crowd was big, less derelict than usual. A few college people, a bus crowd from Wisconsin, stunned dentists and their strap-shouldered wives, some of them without a social event since high school. Lone dancers from dead Protestant crossroads where meager churches jutted like tombstones with steps. Ignited, undulant, gay, half-drunk, friendly. The rage of the casino just behind them, red and gold, a lost football crowd. The wives and husbands were startled by the coyote who shimmered under her black ringlets, curved in her gown like promise itself. The women wanted her for a pet, the men to be an anonymous head eating away at her. Many changed race. Some tried to have ecstasy in Spanish. The band made them doubt there had ever been another life. One who danced alone was John Roman, who could no longer stand the pain at home. His shoulders went up and back. His grey head sweated, his eyes closed. He wanted down the river of trumpet, saxophone, trombone, the raft of rhythm underneath him. Dance some of the grey sick off me, he prayed. Max Raymond searched the crowd even as he played the horn. This was half impossible for the spotlights. He did not play so evilly tonight. His playing was not firmly anything. His coveted wife was nothing to him now, his horn nothing, he was not certain he was clothed. His entrances and choruses with the trombone and trumpet were tepid, staggering, reeling without heart, like a tune wounded but still carrying on down the road in bedroom slippers. It was costume night, and many of the crowd were wearing masks. The coyote was always in the contest, he thought grimly. In her natural stuff, the minimal memorable, her legs. We have a winner. Raymond began to relax during his break when he did not see Mortimer in the dancers or table-siders or anywhere costumed or uncostumed. He settled into a fine jar of wild turkey on ice with a soda and lime to the side and began his lean, bumped by a few fans, those angry and sullen laggards to whom he could play no wrong. Some of them had homemade CDs of only him. Anybody could make a disc now. Our great democracy. Perhaps he and the band were due one. This Latinismo thing would fail, he feared, but it would always be around as long as there were butts and rumbas. It was a shame these baby nihilists creeped him out so, with all their love, and always too early drunk, and their females too, little skanks latched on to the wrongest punks in town. He could not know he was looking straight at his own youth. All that was missing was a war and a pet wolverine. Beside him was a strange figure unmasked, hooking his drink with a claw made out of only natural hand and moaning, perhaps a jester ignored for all his private comedy. Except for some vision half suppressed since the awful night with the bones, Raymond was not aware that Malcolm was lakeside. Now, with a thrill to the pits, Max Raymond recognized him, accompanied by the leaner and sterner couple to his right. He turned away quickly. It was Mimi Suarez the three of them were watching, on stage alone now with piano, bass and drums. Malcolm was the only one who watched with love. The other two seemed saddened by her ballads and intent on suffering, as if they were reviewing their own lunacy, their own love, their own cause. They each seemed alone, separately crucified once more. Penny and Jean Ten Whore. Raymond would play the rest of the night with his back to the audience, like an old idol of cool Miles Davis. His punk following would think he had outdone himself. He hurried back to the stage now, through couples panting and sweaty. A college football man misunderstood Raymond's need and slammed him across the shoulder. He went down into the legs of a screaming mulatto woman bigger than he was. He rose through her kicks while somebody screamed, "He's with the band, bitch." He wondered where this had commenced as her curses followed him through the crowd of masks, Reagan, Nixon, dancing together even without music. Donald Trump's rubber face on a very short man. Even Alan Greenspan. Hillary Clinton pouting but with mouth open, perhaps raving pop eyes. Momentum rang through him like an urgent telephone somewhere ahead. He rushed past John Roman with a handkerchief to his neck and then Man Mortimer. He could not credit they had been dancing together, but he did not slow. Drugged women passed like a discord of mannequins. Or was he drugged when his head cleared? He was high but did not know quite what floor he stood on. It was the curling bandstand. As he held life dearly, so he also yearned to leave it. But now he would play himself somewhere on the instrument. Play it well, with heart and no more belly lint and asthma. Now, when the music began once more, it was John Roman dancing who was incredulous. His partner was Mortimer, uncostumed except in a silk bandit mask and the slick beam-shoot costume he felt compelled to wear against all contingencies. He raised his hands and shuffled violently, an enormous grin on him. "Can you boogie? Can you do the dog? Get down, John Henry oldies but goodies. Simon, Simon, Simon." He was an uncommonly bad dancer, Mortimer, and here with a solitary black male with silver hair, he did not mimic one well either. Just behind him, perhaps betrayed in partners, was Sidney Fart in a very large old-timer's party suit and vest, white shoes. He troubled the floor with some spastic revision of anything right, perhaps clogging or just stomping. But he was happy and grinning and drunk, looking on the back of his bad influence, and not a finer man in the county, old man Mortimer. He the man. John Roman ceased the dance and decided this was the worst possible outcome, to have danced himself to Mortimer. Nausea struck him. Danced to hell and didn't even see. He wanted home to Bernice very badly. Old Sidney slid by, bumping in a kind of march, hands in the air, aimed toward a table where blonde, blood-lipped whores laughed at him. This was enough. "John Roman, the night is young, come on now, man. You ain't showing us nothing," called Mortimer. "We in the club get in the club of the now." He clamped his hand on Roman's sleeve, and there was a too mighty squeeze. Roman tore away. It was a nice coal brown sports coat with a rep tie. Mortimer's fingers themselves seemed coiled and tooth-like serpents. Roman did not realize he was bleeding from the wrist until he was in the car and cranking up. He leaned his head on the steering wheel. He felt sad, weak, small, aching away. His wife would die, he would be one leg in the grave. No more dancing. No song would speak to him. His wrist was wet and he raised it curiously. All his hand was drenched, sticky in its white dress shirt. He felt the pain and now saw the gash. What vicious tiny thing had snagged him? Then a car passed him in the lot with 2 lit skulls on the shelf of its rear windshield. Roman groaned. I used to be a man. People did what I said. I advanced under fire. I had dignity. I walked toward crowds with my head up. Now I hold hands with nonsense. Gnats of spite around my head. I do not know where the fight is or where to give up. Now he supposed he would have to kill Mortimer or start back going to church. With that ponytailed fool Byron Egan. Now that was a man who might have laid a couple out in his days. Lost his old uncle now. Like Roman had almost lost that nice old child Melanie Wooten for a friend. He started the car and drove home to hold the hand of his wife Bernice. Chet Baker was on the tape deck as Roman drove. Nothing. A painful irrelevance worse than silence, especially in the love ballads. They seemed a fraud. They didn't hurt enough. There wasn't any shame in them, only that whimpering lapdog studio tribute to some ghost broad. Vines climbed all over his house front and there was a dim light within. Bernice would shoot the motherfucker, no doubt of that. And she's still got a god, last I asked. I ain't bothered her with him. She's got the chemotherapy, she's got the sleeps, she's got the nausea and the marijuana pills, the THC. Now she's a legal junkie, but not even happy when she's stoned. She's got the baldness that's humiliating her. That wonderful silvery hair gone. She didn't want to look like no fortune teller or woman wrestler. All she wanted was her man and a house, waited half her life to get it. Set in the depopulated reaches of west-central Mississippi, Louisiana across the river. Swamps and flood on both sides, bayous. The great fertile lake that Roman had fished so good, so long. There was no starving here unless you meant money. People got by on enough. Too much electric Havita greed out there anyway. Roman thought he had gotten rid of the disease of want. His life was simple, near good fishing water. In their house he and Bernice shared the easy devotion that comes when you wait and wait. Little rhythms, unspoken speech of love. It seemed not to matter where a mad god was. They had earned this shelter beyond his wrath. Roman knew he was alive somewhere, this god. He had seen his work. And now he had seen Mortimer's. He held the handkerchief to his wet hand, his face cold. His shirt ruined too. Roman had seen such monsters in the service. Only question is whether Mortimer's worth doing any kind of time for. Chet Baker, what is it? It was always there, but we hear it only now and then. Bernice was asleep. One day you say I'm not moving, here is my country, I can't help it, I've fallen into my place, no budging. I'll die here with the ghosts of my old everybody. My Indians, my Africans, my uncles and aunts. Where half was grief, home was at least a hole to have it in. The Allison boys still drove when they had gas, but they did not come near the house with their hot rod. They had washed it for free at several homes and car washes where there was a good machine. We may be next thing to dead children driving this old car, but we will run out our minutes in it. The car had come out of the water and was delivered by the sinkhole, and they knew a true miracle because when Hare dragged it off to put on the last touches, it wasn't but rust and slime yet, and in 5 days had come back riding down the road in this. Even Dee was impressed by the car all painted and running, and she didn't impress easily. Now Isaac and Jacob believe she had to give herself to Hare at the church not too long from now. They dreamed Mrs. Suarez would hold them like puppies for a while and let them listen when her song started. She would sing and they would live high on these notes on her bosom before they were dead by man Mortimer wanting the bones they had lost and the car they came in. They still had his pistol. Bam, bam, bam. But knowing Mrs. Suarez, they promised, we can't kill, we can't be mean no more. The dogs were pleasant strays, all grateful, shivering, made to be a friend of man, happy for the hands that now led them and pulled the burrs, ticks and deer lice from their coats. The hands that gave them their heartworm medicine, their vaccinations. Their eyes were bright and their coats bushy and shined. They were a smiling lot, bidding for attention from Ulrich and Egan. They snuffled over Ulrich and took him down like a short rugby team, a scrum all over the laughing man. He required them for his soul, a new shape taking up its own just lately, and felt distinctly by Ulrich as a pain in his chest. Fixed with Ulrich as his housemate, Egan was feeling better. Another 5-hour surgery at University Hospital in Jackson was over. Ulrich drove him over and back daintily in the woody wagon, wanting to stop and chase down every stray on Highway 20 past Bovina, Edwards, Bolton and Clinton. Egan allowed only 2 severe cases, starving and spiny. The odour, road-gobbled and grease-gamey, was not that bad. At home the dogs fell on a bucket of chicken and lapped water from bowls, then slept on old blankets of feenies. One a spotted hound, one a corgi and shepherd mix they named Wayne. The other after a while they called Woody, for his profession. Egan had shaved his head, which the surgeon liked. The Black Cross had reformed whole, even blacker now that it was out of the gauze, with its Gothic menace. He wore the knife back to St. Peter, who cut off the centurion's ear before Christ could stop him. Such bad faith, such minor work. He was not proud, but he was scared. Both of them missed Feeny very much. Ulrich was certain the old man was killed in the service of his animal ministry, but he did not tell this to Egan because he himself wished to die in this manner. It did not matter when, just let him serve. Given this tenure, he was at peace. Without cigarettes, he was even something of a worker. Egan had a good oblong head on him. Ulrich saw this as a sign of intelligence, although the biker hair never mattered to him, he who had just a pewter scrag on his own head and large ears. Egan joined the part of the elders, and he spoke with them on the pier more as they cleared the burned hulk of the barge and began a new one. What else was there for Harvard? One afternoon Egan told Ulrich, it's time we reached out to the orphans. Get up some of the friendlier dogs, say 4, how about ill help? The kids'll love petting them. I don't know. They're not outgoing folks. But all right, Feena'd been with us. He'd be there. They drove themselves and the dogs, singing songs of faith, anthems of dead ravers and prophets. Luther Longfellow. 12. Today. Maxwell Raymond. Eagle Lake, Mississippi. Copyright at Vicksburg Public Library. My forebears prayed give me Sherman, Grant or a lesser general. Tomb and bump, hit square. This old mistress my rifle. Nasty bite. I call her Mingo, the old bobster. Blue room above the eyes, the nice wide forehead. My headshot our whole lives. Fill your head, Ulysses S. Grant William T. Sherman. The visionary like the loaded gun. If he waits long enough, something will happen. Unless he rusts, unless his eyes collapse. The dark diarist his last words shouted, I'm dying, watch this. You knowest not what I do, rag on the cross. I always loved you, Jesus, and didn't understand much else. These claims, what the Lord wants me to do, Greek to me. I would like the straight Aramaic right from his lips. And why not? This long wait with this much posture gives you the blue soul. I dab and idle, attendant God. I insist my art and path be crooked, in fear there will be a herd of the simple where I want to be. Help my eyes and ears, or just show up, why don't you? Raymond was speechifying to Mimi as never before. He was nearly coherent and it frightened her. They heard a massive gunfire across the lake from the orphans' camp one evening. Now I can feel the madness of grief in the kitchen where Penny talked to the limb. When they lost the boy, I believe they became just people at last and couldn't bear it. Became people, asked Mimi. What were they before? Raymond said aloud, looking past Mimi. Movers, actors, I'd suppose. Sellers, takers, keepers. Some come apart when they discover themselves. As somebody said, acts mark the land, words are only its smoke or something. I despise but am in awe of this couple, Mimi. They simply ran out of words, don't you understand? They dealt with things you touch and hold and appraise. Bodies. Bodies and acts is what they knew. With drugs or without them, bodies and acts. At my deposition nobody wanted to talk drugs, but 2 lawyers wanted Halcyon and Xanax, I tell you. I told them, sorry, I'm a saxophonist. Sure, Jean and Penny were sad, and they were absent the usual compulsion to be good in sadness. Goodness is respected and often mistaken for a cure. Not only words, though, they seemed to have lost even their taste buds toward the end. They went naked or wore clothes to no effect on each other. They collected money. They collected fish. They had destroyed wetlands and aviaries. Now they began nailing it all on the wall. Why is it that you adore the pain and suffering of your family and others? Tell me. Mimi stared hard at him without warmth. Now he was silent. At last. You are in love with ruin. You get a contact high from it. You play your horn like you are sick of the notes sometimes. Why is that? When Mimi left he did have a vision of his old poet mentor speaking out of a fog at the vet's hospital, speaking as he had done in the late 70s. Oh, I found my feminine inside long ago, Max. It's Edna, an old Navy dyke. The poet did not smile. Ulrich and Egan returned home with their petting zoo intact. They met Malcolm, who carried a rifle negligently at his left leg, telling them he was the victim of Max Raymond and he loved Mimi Suarez. The proximity alone seemed to please him. All this he told Ulrich and Egan while they looked at a few bullet holes in the woody wagon. Jean and Penny were on horseback. An accident. They were sorry. Harvard, who worked to salvage what good timber might be left of the launch, was annoyed when Ulrich and Egan's dogs came to the pier. He was querulous in his suffering over Melanie. He pouted in her presence and scowled. This might be her last year of radiance. Harvard hoped it was. She was unbearable to him. America is dreadful for the emeritus, or so Harvard thought. Once a god, a surgeon of few mistakes, now an eccentric out to pasture. His neighbors connected him to more charming days when doctors made house calls and bespoke themselves in soft benisons. Some might hit him for a drug now and then. He began searching the aisles of the launch, through cinder and ashes, and finding bullet slugs. He knelt and studied them. Mushroomed .22 magnums, .3030 and buckshot. Harvard raked through the coals and could hear the slugs rattling. He cleared the embers, the broken stained glass, the half-fuse, the quarter wheel. He had once lived across the street from a man with thick glasses. He owned no car. The neighbors called him the walking man. He walked everywhere morning and evening, and nobody knew his mission. He did not sing, laugh, play. He had no work except perhaps at the library. In his thick glasses he seemed to be taken up with the traffic. Going and returning was a demanding event. You would stop to offer him a ride and he would brusquely refuse. He did not answer his phone. He once drank but he stopped. He smoked but he quit. He may have been a failed scholar, a torn philosopher. The thick glasses controlled him. Earnest and officious, even fervent in his walk, without humor. Never smelled a rose. It was a free country. Harvard wondered why the neighborhood boys hated him so. Sheriff Faisto and Bernard were in the bait store one evening in khakis and t-shirts and canvas shoes, a jumboat in the gravel out front. The weather was mild and the winter crappie season was in, and they had in mind filling a freezer box with fillets for a county beer and fish picnic the middle of February. Big slabs lurked thick as necklaces in the brushy sinks near the spillway. Mortimer in the back did not recognize the sheriff and his deputy through the storeroom window. But these men were not leaving until they learned the color of jig and depth for the slab crappie. The locals were leaning around freezer chests close to a pot-bellied stove with a good fire. 2 of them were having a sport on the sheriff and thought he ought to find out himself about the jig color and technique. It wasn't something you just handed over to a foreigner. It took years, many bad mornings, many frozen spines. Mortimer could see the skinny younger one, Bernard, getting angrier over this matter. Mortimer recognized the sheriff and deputy the same moment he saw the thing on the top rack. 2 full-size footballs secured in tandem by foot-long black strips of canvas webbing with Velcro at the ends. It was a life preserver, worn around the neck. Pepper's old footballs. Sidney was having a go at invention. The weekend after the costume dance, when he had gotten with 3 large women for special tastes right out of Mortimer's service, the experience of which, he told Mortimer and Lloyd, was like rolling around in a warm room. He had worn Mortimer's silk bandit mask all weekend behind his store counter. The effect on a fishing Sunday was disquieting to his hungover clients, drinking beer rapidly before they could decide whether to stay. Now Mortimer was staring dead on at Faisto, through the glass, and quite unknown to him. He could have rammed a bolo through the 2-way storeroom mirror into the man's very face without his ever knowing what nightmare had struck him. Years ago a man had driven into the bait shop at night, hungry and with the inventory of an entire bankrupt sporting goods store in a Fortin truck. It was hot summer, tree frogs and gnats having a way at the air, aggravating the man's thirst. He was broke, bankrupt and alcoholic, and he knew not where he was. He figured perhaps Kansas. Nobody else was in the store. He appealed to Pepper's charity, spoke to him curiously, as if he might be the governor of the state, who was at that time a graceless Yahoo whipping up racial purity among even lesser Yahoos in confrontation with the brothers Kennedy, who wanted 1 black man in the university at that time. He spoke as if Pepper were in charge of large fates and was known far and wide for his special attunement to the troubles of the little man in this often heartbreaking and deceptive land. He indicated waves of wheat and torrents of oranges out through the door. "I will do anything for a drink and a sandwich," he told Pepper. "I have a truck full of sports equipment and not a dime. For a bottle I could give you a whole lot of sports equipment. Playground, floor play. There might even be fishing stuff in there, I'm sure there is. Isn't there a good bottle, 2 bottles, and a hamburger?" He looked over at the greased meat and soggy bread under the heat lamp row across the way. A man on the television was pouring down a frosty mug of beer so sweet it seemed to create new muscles of pleasure in his throat. "First," said Pepper, unmoved but interested, "I want you to get out a football. Go get it out of the truck there. Something might be waiting on you. Take your time and get a good football, your best." "My best football. I got one kind the best." "A hutch. You got it." When he came in with it, a bottle of Maker's Mark sat beside a greasy burger on a napkin with a bottle of mustard next to it. Pepper seemed to have moved no place nor fretted. The man held out the big football. "Now I want you to suck it. Suck this football. Get a lot of it in there." "Old man, why do you love football at your game?" "I hate it." "Suck it now. On in there, moan around on it." The man did caterwauling and gagging. "Is that all right, goddamn? You reckon it's really pig hide? Go on, get your drink now. We can be trading for a while now. There's a place for you. Some old crazy man's tree house, he left it. But the tree house is professional. The tree'd blowed down 'fore the house would. He left meat around on the floor like. You going to want to clean some with the critters comin' after the smell at night." The man stayed for 6 weeks, fed from the store, sane minnows, and caught grasshoppers and crayfish for Pepper, and stayed mainly drunk high in the bows singing with a transistor radio. There was a wire up to it for reading or coffee. Then he left, and the truck was all Pepper's. He had sold off most of the gear to fairly delighted people who had hobbies. That is, outside fishing, hunting, weather discussion and church. But he kept the boxes of footballs in the storeroom. When he saw the boy children come along with their fathers to learn the way of the world, he would look at them with no expression and refuse them a football for their own. It was believed he kept the balls as a memorial to the ungodly humiliation he had wrestled from the bankrupt creature those many years ago. Mortimer felt suddenly that he had to buy a new pair of shoes. He was doing this a lot lately. He felt a bit sick and nervous. In the storeroom thinking about the footballs, looking at the sheriff, he felt dirty and low-rent. He went out the back and almost immediately drove at breakneck speed into Vicksburg to purchase a pair of shoes. He wanted bright white ones. Perhaps a boot, a soft suede pair you could hold in your hands while you went off to sleep in any house and feel perfectly at home. The next day when he went out to talk to the lay preacher who kept the jump car lot, he would buy yet another pair. Sandals, and it cold. He knew he would probably never wear them, but still the excitement held. Out in the bait shop, a geezer was telling the sheriff, "You got your chartreuse with sorty beige spots, throw it out there with a sorty small fire plug weight on her, and y'all want a good rope size, say about like a Venetian blind pull rope on her. Them slap crappy is big and mean with the teeth too like a bandsaw sorty." Bernard the deputy was incensed, being an actual fisherman. The sheriff spoke as if nothing had been heard, nothing mocked. He said to Sidney, who was smirking behind the counter, "You don't think the football contraption is a bit in bad taste considering your father's murder?" He quieted the air. "Something like church in there now. Family tradition is a man's own lookout, like his choice of faith, sir." The sheriff did not miss the "sir" and was astounded that Sidney spoke of faith at all. He was slow to anger, but these crackers were getting confident around him. "The faith of your father's is a chicken hawk, and everybody knows it, Sidney. Tradition. I don't guess y'all be welcome in my store from now on unless you got papers, friend. But by the way, they're taking slab crappy with a light cork, a foot deep on a fuchsia and frog-green jig, sometimes tip it with a small minnow. I seem to be all out of those substances at the moment, but good luck." Bernard and Feister proceeded to the spillway, where there was another tribe entirely, honored to have the sheriff and his man fish elbow to elbow with them as they waded the little rapids over gravel and worked the pools with a light spin cast, lent them jigs and corks hand over fist in that almost belligerent hospitality the state of Mississippi is famous for. The two felt much better and had a full chest before long, and it was splendid to get out of the cold water, rip off the waders, and toast in the car, alternating on hot espresso and cold Louisiana beer. "I'm sheriff of these folks too, thank the Lord," said Feisto. "The truth, folks is all right. It just seems tense at the lake nowadays." The sheriff grew solemn. "Melanie, did the deputy know, or was it something else he meant? Trouble at the orphans' camp, the immolation of the oldsters barge, the disappearance of yet another pair of girls from Oasis. Old Pepper's seated corpse, bleeding in ropes from the neck while a football stood for his face. The tracing of that jacket preacher Byron Egan to a methadone ring of long years standing, a 48 Ford coupe reported stolen from the St. Aloysius junkyard and replaced by a filthy rusted-out car of exactly the same vintage, and that stolen car had been reported running down scarcely known county roads, driven by minors, and then parked in a cemetery near the home of D. Allison, the sex bomb about whom a groaning man had said she'd fuck a snake just to hurt it. She had 4 kids, great legs and other acreage, but the talk was she was getting married soon, right there in the cemetery. Shut your mouth. Right in it. 13. Mortimer had 4 dreams in a row one Wednesday night. He had performed a small amount of manual labor in his runaway years, and the work itself was nightmare enough, although it trained him never to go thereabouts again. In each dream he was fired from a different jobs he had done in real life. Offshore drilling in Louisiana, lumberyard, car salesman, offshore drilling again off the chandeliers out of Gulfport. In each dream the boss man came up and said, "Get out, that's enough of you." Then came a 5th dream in which his own mirror told him he was an imposter in the body of Conway Twitty. Then his mirror fired him. But he killed it. A funeral was held with a coffin and pieces of glass. The woman and the boy showed up. They were trying to have a funeral, but her father was late and they could not start. Mortimer said he just can't find his clothes, that's all. You don't know the outfit for a mirror funeral. But he knew he was lying. The news was that her father was coming naked. So they waited at the graveside next to the hole. but instead came Frank Booth, with whom D. Allison had betrayed Mortimer. They walked in naked like two crabs locked together. Booth was saying, "Please help me. I can't pull it out of her. Somebody's got to cut. Help us." Mortimer woke in horror, the sun streaming in his window. Yet he had only a few moments of relief before he was in full need from waking life. He was going to have to cut again. This matter was no longer spontaneous. He knew exactly what he would do when he saw the junkman Pedden again. Fire him in his dreams. Pedden, his lackey, who owed him money. Pedden was a Protestant. Why then, Mortimer mused, did he spend his idle time making graven images? What did graven mean of the grave? Serious, heavier graver. He graved nearly all his free time. Over their graving is what? Pedden carved wood. He was one for animals like Mrs. Wooten and her glass. Mortimer said out loud, "You look at me. I don't seem the type to go about having such thoughts on my own. Up high in my navigator, this new green buggy, swank, but look again, looker. I have these thoughts." In fact, he could not quit having these new thoughts that gave him a hand on the common man and the old life he was rushed from by such forces as he now despised. He recalled the mobile phone he had bought Dee once, and the first time he saw it in her hands, in the BMW he had also given her. Must be 2 years ago. They were new then too. He thought the phone, deep red, was very intimate, and her words, it didn't matter which ones, excited him. He saw now the red phone in her fingers, her fingernails very red, her toenails too, and then he imagined the razor scarred down her thigh, and he could not stand it. He wondered if she would ever forgive him, how crazy he was to do it. But that red phone next to her fingers, her lips. He wondered would there be a day when he would open the car door for her to get in, and on the back seat would be her 2 younger boys sitting there. He could play with them, make new games. There would come a day he could change, nobody'd recognize him. He might even resemble nobody at all, or a pleasant television star. These things happen. You can get a lot with money. He thought of his sequence of good cars, and then the whores. His work was his play. That's what they said of players. He was either moving or flat out dead asleep, it didn't matter under what roof. Probably he was a sea shark, even if he feared the sea. Death by sea. Life by eating a great many others. But he had his kindnesses. He was not tight. He set a plate for the unlucky, like the lay preacher Pedden, until this car, under his eye, rode off. Just the core of the apple of his eye, it just rode off, and its mud-bottom rust-faced sister is your date. Old preacher boy Pedden eating from the plate and whittling his idolatrous beasts and strumming his psalms. Great hell, he lives there, otherwise it would be Haven House or a box in back of the Salvation Army. This man's been passing for a sound old junk general too long, he's got himself into trouble. Well, here comes not hardly, Mortimer said to himself, dressing for battle. Hedden has his coming. The shack at St. Aloysius' junkyard was an old shotgun house weathered to a pale of grey and retar-pippered and tarped in spots on the roof for rain. The 2 snows they had in the decade, the edge of a horrendous ice storm. It was warm inside, burned a good modern Franklin. It was electrified, telephoned, a small pawnshop refrigerator did its duty for beer or milk or bacon or the whole old hams Pedden often bought at the discount grocery. A stove of propane. Pedden liked to keep a soup going during a major bender. He would make the soup days in advance, and it worked so that he was not detected incompetent until a fire broke out or he drove some elected junker queen all around the lot honking the horn and ploughing into even more terminal junkers. The law was not necessary. A neighbor black fellow phoned in. Grandson of the owners of the house and the original property years ago, still proprietary although sold out. Then Lloyd or others would come and settle Mr. Pedden, clutching his Bible and tearfully spouting out hard plain Seanos truths from the Book of Revelation. His recovery usually lasted a week, and he was a very good man afterward for a very long time. When he was sober, he expressed the sentiment that he wished the Book of Revelation had never been written, and that it might even have the hand of Satan in it. His speech and dress were clean. The clothes were the best of the Salvation Army, and he loved suspenders with a good brogan, no cheap second-tier leather. Perhaps he wanted to be a bit old-timey or reminiscent of his own old wise uncle, who had been a barber and taught private guitar lessons. Pedden was once a barber too. He played original interpretations of anything on amplified violin. The black fellow across the hollow who was his monitor wished he would not do this. Pedden's amplifier was powerful. It had been abandoned on Highway 20, almost in Pedden's lap, and it still had the name and logo of a heavy metal outfit, its former owners, painted on it. Pedden drove a Comet, a thing out of the age of Sputnik. Low expectations. But he could fix it. He couldn't fix everything, but he could fix this weary orbiter. When he was drunk and driving it, he imagined he was riding a hydrogen bomb to Los Angeles. But when Pedden was sober, he was apt to wonder if there was a god, or not simply a divine wind of oratory investing man, and this divine wind was blind and deaf and cared not in whom or at what time it manifested itself. Pedden had not meant to either be a lay preacher or play electrified fiddle. But look here, he couldn't help himself, and he had no models for these behaviors. He could not name one electrified violinist. He knew no other preachers but Byron Egan, whom he had met recently in their common run back and forth from ruin. And what of those pastors who were always Christian and wore new three-piece suits and had the ears of large congregations? Byron Egan said they were lucky but soft, for even Christ was not a Christian until the day he needed to be and knew it. Cars were pulled up near the shack at the portals with the open stormware panels with the chain lock hanging down. There were too many cars. Mortimer recognized some of them, he thought, and listened to a harangue of some sort in the shack proper. One of the first whose back he saw was Frank Booth. Then the back of Dee Allison herself, and Spence, who seemed to be handing her off to some other young fool. The other young idiot held something interesting in his hands. The keys to the 48 coupe. Mortimer knew them well. Didn't even bother taking the rabbit's foot off, the thick thief. He looked around for the car but didn't see it. He knelt behind a shed and listened to Pedden go on to this large group, and he saw many he knew, was in fact intimate with. They spoke back to Pedden, young but creased in his large tweed suit and vest. When he became a Christian, the lay preacher took on the appearance of the actor Strother Martin, and he began wearing suits, also of the Salvation Army. The furniture about him was nicked but pleasant enough. Mortimer set the plate for him. He owned him, without rancor until the loss of this automobile. He'd even send over Lloyd or Eddie to keep him from burning his furniture after a drunk as he attempted. Some days you wish you'd married an ugly woman and somebody in your world would stay grateful, thought Mortimer, and do their job and smile. What we make with our hands, what we worship. Pedden was going on. The rest was long, spotty although sober, Mortimer noticed. Eavesdropping on his own property was making him angrier by the minute. I have been under airplanes, under cars, Pedden said, the smoke from the chimney pipe rising upward with his voice in cold air. God has given me the ends of cars where dead convicts, ladies, babies and little puppies were flung against dashboards. This is my vision, my garden, brothers and sisters and uncles. He has given me the jaws of life to pry the poor victim dead or alive from the bunched steel where a snake could barely crawl through. Like if a chicken truck hit a Volkswagen. Amen, said Byron Egan, standing toward the front of the room. People are forgotten as soon as they are slaughtered, except by a few loved ones, you know that, Pedden went on. Forgotten in these stains of blood you will find on the seat covers and floorboards and ceilings around this yard. Don't even take the little ones with you if you look. Pedden raised his arms in the big suit. He did not look funny, just thicker than one supposed. The Lord has given me this junken place, freed me of drink and drug, and sent a friend, Byron Egan, all the priest a Christian American ever needed. And best, he has given us his book, which every man and every woman can read. Pedden breathed long, for this was difficult, and Mortimer felt the sensation of another man standing up amazed inside his own body. familiar shape, with its khaki sport jacket and its safari boots recently removed from the pelt of floor rugging in his great Lexus. I announce that D. Allison is Mrs. Harold Laird, and that Harold Laird is her husband. May the Lord bless this couple. I would say young couple, but a teenage separates them, as it were. Dee lowered her head, and Harold was not amused, although he liked Pedden, who could have gotten the law on him before his confession and seeking of mercy. Harold wished he knew where the boys had taken the car. Her last husband, Cato, is present, I believe, to confirm the divorce has been finalized and that he approves this union and defies any who might stand against it. And Harold has vowed to be the loving father and mentor of her 4 children. I say, Cato, you are Cato. A tall man of graceful carriage, hair still black and thick, in a nice wedding suit, grey, leaned forward as if he had learned a courtesy faintly European, a roll of the hand and a bow in the affirmative, and a calm smile on his well-cut face. Cato is here in protection of the boys and of his other boy or man, Spons, for a while. The agreement to his protection and his support has been amicably decided upon, and his custody of the young Emma for an agreeable while during the honeymoon period and other adjustments. He seems a fine man, Cato, and will be a father to this favoured lass, who smiles every time she sees him enter a room, and this makes her mother happy too. And they will be father and daughter in Toronto, Canada, for as long as the mother assents. Except for the filth and low-mindedness, he would still reside in the USA, he says. Well, the America I know could have kicked Canada's ass all the way back to Paris and London, but out of the generosity of its great high-minded cleanliness of spirit, it has refrained from that minor task. But why am I going on like this at a wedding? I would surmise I am now out of control and will hand the services off to Brother Byron Egan. I do hope I have married the right people here during this spell. I don't feel shipshape right now and I apologize. Remember the good words, if they happened. I'm going to go take a nap. Egan stepped up and indicated a seat between Spons and Emma. Cato looked discomfited but was trying to smile warmly. His smile grew thinner, then curved back with a will. Mortimer could make out no more than a third of this matrimonium and was by no means certain whether anybody had been married, but he was amazed and baffled by the presence of Cato, Dee's husband, who sent checks from Toronto. He was a better-looking and better-preserved man than Mortimer expected. Otherwise, he was outraged any ceremony was transpiring on his property and in a junkyard. Why not the church? And what was Egan here? He seemed to be only a lackey. Egan's face was 3/4 healed, and he looked the same but leaner, and his head was shaved. He had cut down severely on the number of rings he wore, and he now went with a woman named Lottie who sat in front of him admiringly, an ex-junkie alumna of various mild lunatic communes, in which she was invariably the leading advocate and then the first to pack off. Now a nurse, mildly religious, wild for teas of all nations, a smoker, good legs and quite defined high rump, baby lips. She had recently become an advocate of sexual abstinence, which was killing Egan, and he preached to her as well as the flocks, wooing them both. Mortimer knew Lottie too, although if asked his memory would be hazy, tentative, as if she'd been confused with her cousin. He had collaborated with Lottie a few years before on a porn acupuncture video that went nowhere, exciting only Mortimer and Eddie. They decided it was too educated and had no audience outside, the Chinese grocery dynasties in Vicksburg and upward through the Delta. Marketing to old Chinese grocers was too delicate. Besides, the plot was thin, and why were there so many white people hanging around in the background just looking incredulous? But Lottie had looked good as a Chinese woman. Now Egan spoke. "Old brother, sit down and strip off your burden. Good Pedden has risked much when not in the best shape. All of us in this strange church on the border of a junk pyramid, in the very parlour of the man who has hurt many of us so badly and so permanently, who has blackmailed us and cowed us and bullied us. Strip off your burdens, get lighter and junk yourselves. Pedden has brought us into the halfway house of his life, is gainfully employed by the very wretch at the heart of our troubles. I think the wretch is attempting to play to have friends. Frank Booth suddenly turned around in his cartable chair and looked through the window directly at Man Mortimer without seeing him. Booth's face had been reconstructed too, but radically. He looked exactly like Conway Twitty, mid-career, but instead of the tall, thick hair, he had his own nearly bald head with strings of grey-white. Healthy sideburns. Mortimer quivered and nearly lost his legs, weak, firing with nerves. He knew he had not been seen, but he had sure seen Booth. He almost left the yard on his belly, crawling. His face. "We are expecting 2 more guests shortly," Egan continued, "and we owe them our attention even if we do not like them. There is the business of marrying Jean and Penny yet again, in renewal of their vows. The couple will soon be here with their best man, Malcolm, a new member of the lake community whose handicaps have not prevented his service to the children at the camp." "Malcolm is coming here," cried out Max Raymond. "Will he be armed?" "Well, who isn't?" Pedden said from his chair. "I personally know a peaceful soul, a sculptor and motorcycle mechanic, in possession of over 150 guns. He likes to hold the history. Malcolm is an ex-patient of mine who wants to harm me," Raymond said. "But let him come. Let him do what he has to do. I stand to pay, and if it's my time, am ready to die for my sin." Mimi Suarez was seated next to her husband. On this outburst, she rose and slapped him very hard, then left the meeting. Mortimer hid himself entirely behind a tin outbuilding where sparkplug harnesses hung. "Could I ask?" called out Sidney from his perch near the door. He had not been invited, and few had known he was there. "Is this a town meeting, a church gathering, or are you just screwing the pooch here?" "Or just a debating society," said Dr. Harvard angrily. "Led by 2 thugs who've exchanged one addiction for another and who want to rub our noses in junk. Your revenge on others who've tried to bring some beauty and light into the world." "Fine words, Doc," Sidney sneered. "No noble rot about it. Not one mention has been made of the animals, for whom old Feeney died." Ulrich began weeping. He was smoking a cigarette and soon was hacking out bottomless gut calls, knocking over his oxygen tank. But he would not be helped. "We're going on our way," said Harold, the new husband. "We've got underage kids and an automobile to find." He picked up baby Emma, and Carter the Torontoan followed him, sponce and D out the aisle between the chairs. Carter still with his suave readiness to fly toward northern sanity and newly claimed fatherhood. It was a different audience who waited for the renewal of vows from Jean and Penny. They were getting remarried naked and had written their own nuptial poems, and so although the crowd was surlier, they were by no means less alert. Lewis, Wren, and Harvard lingered only to get a full frontal on Penny, who, though insane, was still a fine looker with nail marks about her ankles. Jean had the hack marks on his thigh. Trim, he wouldn't make a bad nude either, though his red beard and freckles and wild woolly hair looked as if they were fleeing in a Ridanway confetti protest. The altar empty, people looked forward, backwards, sideways. Malcolm was late. Max Raymond was still there, determined to look his nemesis in the face. Hedden had risen and was clear to marry folks again. It was his nature to get suddenly clear. They awaited Melanie and Festo. What arrogance was detaining them, or were they deliberately missing the nude wedding? Jean and Penny were eager. Mortimer stayed in the plug harness shed. He would wait until all had cleared out but Pedden. Then Pedden was his. He already was, but he had forgotten and needed the touch of his master. Why do we keep as keepsakes the implements of our own destruction and hang them on the wall? Mortimer wondered. As if they were not hung between our ears. Near Mortimer's head, on the wall, was a kind of shillelagh wrapped with barbed wire that Pedden had used in biker and mobile home fights. There was either dried blood or shoe polish on it. It was 3 feet long, shaped like a narrow bowling pin, with all its weight in the head. Mortimer figured if Pedden was so proud of this, the man should know what it felt like. He knew he did not have the strength of old, but this club should carry the day. He wondered about just a bash, repeated bashes, without the first softness, the G, the little feathers at the base of his spine. Did Mortimer have it in him, or would his hand go to his rear pocket where the rug knife rested in joy? He was wondering when the day would be that they would let him back into real life, which he had once thought possible, at age 16 in southern Missouri, looking out back at the chicken yard. Little bit of rain coming down. Not lonesome. But the chickens looked happy and they were so dumb, scratching and lurching. Killed and ate them, but his mother was very tender with them. They had names for their short time. Mortimer began to cry, just a little, and soon stopped. Then, through the smudged window, he saw Jean and Penny pulling off their clothes on the porch of the shotgun shack. They both had long, gnarled feet, he noticed, as if these parts had married and grown alike in time. And Faisto and Melanie were about to walk right up on the disrobing couple before they realized it. John Roman may have been the most uncomfortable at the nude wedding. The world wasn't meant to be but naked and smiling ear to ear, he reasoned, and here came the poems. Pedden presided woozily over the entire thing. Here was a man who in his bad days had almost blown Roman over on a gravel road riding his giant Harley next to Roman's little motorbike loaded with fish. Now a Christian orator when he was not playing hooky from the anonymous program. Roman was there because it was a place to be out of the house with Bernice. He knew he could not shoot Mortimer if Bernice lived on and lived well, so he had deferred the headshot on Mortimer. Roman was the only trained killer on the lake. He could summon a chilliness beyond such huffers as Raymond, who had recently confessed to Roman his own wound at the hands of Mortimer. How could Mortimer risk all his whole world and his fleet of lust hearses, all his women and thugs, for a bit of fun like this? Now in stumbled the best man. Clothed, thank the Lord for small favours, but dragging a leg and unable to make low sounds like, for instance, a whisper. But what protocol was appropriate when two fools rammed together in poetry to initiate some awful Eden all over again? Couldn't Jean have combed his hair or worn shoes? I seen this guy in the tin hut, Malcolm was moaning to the back row. He was ignored. Penny picked up a guitar and began strumming and hooting a song directed toward the higher obedience of everybody to the untenanted, unastronauted moon. When Roman first heard of integration, he thought it was a movement about meeting and drinking with people like Chet Baker, and he was a partisan. But it was mostly the Pennies and the Jeans and the Peddens and the Splintwa Raymonds who were at the table. Pedden began speaking, looking neither left nor right. Thank you for your arrival, Malcolm. It is good a husband and wife freshen their vows. We lose sight of the face of God, which we must at least try to see every day, and we lose sight of each other. We become annoying mists to each other, let's face it. Egan said those words. I stole them. No, wait, I've got my poem, said Sidney. This grainy man was in the doorway watching all worlds. Women. You can't live with them and you can't fuck their ears. Melanie alone was scandalized, but she had brought her own scandal with her, and so she stayed quiet. The ceremony jerked on to its end, and Sidney, nervous as Judas, suddenly ran for his car. Mortimer saw this act, hoping the rest would leave shortly. He was not good at waiting. Egan moved among the crowd, glad the wedding was quick. There was no reception. The sheriff began talking loudly. I wasn't quite done, Faisto, said Pedden. It's my house we're in. Pedden didn't like cops. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I thought we were going to talk about the man. Sure we are. Now I'm through talking. Go ahead. We are needing testimony against man Mortimer, said Faisto. This sounds like you on television. The new breed of high sheriff, taunted Pedden. What the hell is new about Mortimer? The sheriff was angry, red. You've gotten plenty of airtime, Sir. Harvard broke in. Much expatiation on criminology. Little actual arresting of it. There is not much you have done except Harvard swept his hand toward Melanie, dally with a woman twice your age. I am older than that. We are in love, said Melanie. In heat, spat Harvard. I think Faisto should advocate for the woman he loves. Or whatever negligent sheriffs do. Man, you can't serve. Phaester was mad. He had been taunted by mail, the telephone, distant shouts, and now by this considerable old surgeon whose intelligence he could not deny. "You've got an orphans militia over there," said Lewis. "Somebody's going to be hurt." "I've spoken to them," Phaester said. Many folks stood up and milled, just absorbing him. Nobody else was listening. They were talking on their own and leaving. He was very sorry he had come. There was no face to maintain here, no walk to walk. He felt himself melting and near tears. His gun hand trembled. He was beginning to join the hate for himself. Melanie saw all this. She could not rush to him, and in fact she despised him a little herself. "You can't gang up and destroy this man. He's a good man. He works hard," Melanie was saying. This too was ignored, drowned out, mocked. They themselves left and Pedden was alone. Pedden, with a coffee, fresh and hot French roast from his loyal Big Mart maker, was in agreeable shape finally. The last of the kicks of the lush, peaceful even during the last wedding. No longer threaded out and driven forward, he sat and reviewed the life he lived in the junkyard, and he found it good. These stacks and caverns of heavy metal around him, they had a quietness, a solid face. It was something, he was something that made it signify. He had the Lord, he had his time. Who suspected any would haul in this rotted rust and take the better version of the same 48 with them? Pedden still hoped he would get over it and that his old debt would be forgiven. The debt was this. Pedden had once gone into Mortimer while very drunk and asked him for $13,000 to buy a new Harley-Davidson Softail. Everything depended on it, Pedden thought, for his own esteem. His soul was already in the bike. It was only a matter of what he would do to get it. He had a woman named Bertha at that time from up at Redwood. She had satellite television and they had a good time, she mainly sober. Bertha fell off his new machine on a curve out of Panther Burn on Highway 14. She had no medical plan, only Pedden. Pedden borrowed more, and Bertha began working for Mortimer at the car place in Vicksburg. SUV demos. Good deals. Now Pedden was in big hock, and the interest was berserk, but he and Mortimer kept smiling, and Bertha's back and leg were okay. Pedden lit a lucky, sat and stretched in front of the pot-belly wood stove. Very nice to be out of the rain, very comfortable here. Didn't need the television on, even if it was a good big fat Philips like Bertha's. He thought of Byron Egan, what a constant pal he was. How all was right when Egan cheered him. Pedden had had another pal who died, Debord. Debord had simply gotten lung cancer and died, but Pedden was certain his friend rode next to him still. Whenever he thought of Debord, and then Egan, he became spiritual. Perhaps he should not even read the newspaper to keep it that way. The trio was all they needed. One happened to be gone and needing no coffee anymore, but riding with them, his white hair behind him like fleece in a legend. Just then a man came in the window with a club, clambering over the windowsill from the shotgun porch. Pedden couldn't believe it was Mortimer or that he was coming straight at him this way. Later he thought Mortimer expected he'd be watching television when he came in. The club was big, with wire around it. Pedden didn't recognize it until Mortimer had limped away with little effeminate screams. Mortimer hit him once on the shoulder, then Pedden was all over him, picking up chairs and an old wooden coke case. He thrashed on Mortimer very well, over and over. Saw he was going for the hip, where there was a knife, he well knew. Pedden beat and beat on Mortimer until the man could take no more, found the door and dragged away, without even a threat. For a good long while Pedden rubbed his shoulder and thought about a trip to the hospital. Then he decided on it but grew cold when he thought of Mortimer. He doubted the man could stand and feared rooming with him in the emergency ward. This was not a problem. Mortimer was not in the building. 14. Pedden was a strong man. He was muscular in total despite the years of hard living. His shoulder was bruised black but healed quickly. Mortimer did not heal much at all, but he didn't languish long. He hurt in every pore, every tissue. Even his lips had been hit. He was not angry at Pedden. He would kill him, he was quite sure, and perhaps with his own hands. But he could not blame him. He hated his attitude, hopeful in his stupid mistakes, the 48 and now fighting back. When he called up Pedden, he told him to destroy the ruined 48, take it to bits, every cell. His voice was even, and Pedden wondered if the fight had proved something. Mortimer himself wondered whether he would have to use a gun, for which he had no affection. He hoped not, but things would be coming up. His tongue was getting more tied, he could not explain and modify as he used to do. The wedding. On my own property, and with a medium-sized mechanic, a fool. Frank Booth, too, chilled him with his bald head and twitty face. What tribute was this, or was the man deranged and unaware of what he had become? Bald Conway Twitty, if he had lived longer. Booth's appearance was a bad thing of the shadows, and Mortimer was horrified he would come near with some other weapon. Maybe he should call the sheriff. Mortimer smiled. Unbalanced the man still more. He would say it was out of his jurisdiction, but Mortimer would keep after him. He dialed. He loved the whining answer, the trembling he heard, the remonstrations. "Oh, it's special all right," Mortimer said. "Man mocking me like this. Got a whole new face to do it." Why did he need a new face? "Don't you even read the papers, man?" "I read a lot of papers." "You don't want to forget who you're talking to, sir." "I don't have to stand for this." "Yes, I'm sorry. Getting out of hand over here. It's just spooky. Thought you could speak to him." What would I say to the man about his chosen face? Most of us don't have that option. I see your point. You don't just go up to a fellow and say, "Fellow, I don't like your face." You don't. Well, I do, all the time. Too much, I guess. Thanks for your time, anyway. Who is this again, Mort? Yes, sir, Commander Faisto. They don't call me Commander. Sheriff is fine. I'm sure it is. Bye now. He had a vision of piling all his SUVs together some afternoon and burning them while the sheriff's department and other fools looked on. Mortimer knew Sidney was his man when he wanted him, and he was able enough to drive to the bait store on a Thursday when he could also hold down some soft black-eyed peas and corn bread at the bad restaurant. Sidney's lackey Opal was minding the store, but this girl told him Sidney was down to the new boat in Fart Cove. When he drove by, he saw Sidney amid a great mix of men and advisors nearly working on the boat. It was another barge going up, all right, and now Mortimer wanted it, to sail it and make it smell good and have something for his whores. He would be well known on the lake and finally a pride of the region when he became an elder, because you were colourful then and people liked to see you prosper. Get nostalgic about when times were colourful and wilder and better. Let go because of history and what Yao done for it. A picture of him shaking hands with the law. A giant 3-deck riverboat with paddle wheel in the background. Rest home of old whores and fishing. This joke hurt his liver when he laughed. Still, he liked Dr. Harvard and the suddenly plentiful crowd. He didn't know a third of them, must be 12, 15 down there. Sidney was off the deck but the centre somewhere at the end of the pier, jawing. The boat would be his in the future. I made Sidney famous, thought Mortimer. They heard the big stuff over at the camp on a Saturday afternoon. It was dynamite. The 10 whores had decided to make an island out of their camp, and nobody could stop them after they got the explosives permit, which was fairly easy. You can blow up your own place if you've room for it. Harvard, Lewis and Wren working on the barge, with Roman and Raymond lifting heavy pieces for them, and Sidney looking on, heard the whumps. They were blowing canals. They had hired this company, but the leader of the gang was a man who lived to change the earth. He was 70 and loved his job. He had not gotten enough of this in Korea with the Marines, blowing away bridges and roads in the famous retreat from Chosin Reservoir that cost the communists 1 million dead. But this man had not veered. He was happier then than he had ever been, except for right now. Imagine making an island out of your place suddenly, he said. Imagine. Right here at home. It was going to take a lot of bomb here. Across the lake the men and Melanie and Bernice could see the sky get humps of black along its horizon line, perhaps whole trees and their dust. Sydney hoped for an enormous accident if this was not one already. Limbs and ash and burnt spray in the air. A real shame. Ruthner, Harb, Alexander and Witt arrived that afternoon. They had decided they could no longer abide the suburbs, especially since they could not make the house payments. They were something on the order of a middle-aged commune and quickly agreed that nature and the lake were just the thing. It was changing them even as they hauled in their luggage, in fact. They had rented a modern, beamed skillage affair, which gave the tourist the rare sense of having fallen off an Alp into a steaming bog. They were near the Roosevelt Lodge where Ulrich and Egan lived. When the dynamiting started, they were horrified. Their tall white sycamores trembled. They were hungover and in hell. Ruthner fell flat on the ground. Witt held his ears while his luggage scattered. He is always talking about his mother and father and Christ, said Mimi once the scare had passed. Ruthner was becoming her confidante. Then he will be tired of talking, Mimi. All theological discussion will become shameful comedy. He has said people are snakes who love talking late at night about God. They don't know God, but they surround themselves with other pretenders. These are direct quotes, I think, said Ruthner, who knew Raymond too well. But what does Raymond have for acts? He has his saxophone. He doesn't even have much money left. He has the friendship of punks and old men. And you. Maybe he will do something for the orphans, like his mother did. He can't forget her. He tries. He speaks of his deaf, absent father all the time, the gunner in the war against Japan. I think he was jealous of the orphans, said Mimi. I've got to go. Well, try to be sober next time we see you. Things have fallen apart and we've fallen here. You're at the right place, Ruthner. I don't know anybody much who's not decomposing. Even Max says people are hardly necessary anymore, and they have no acts. They tend to float away. It's frightening. If the Son of God has not visited us, Mimi, who are we? Am I just a lush and actress and tramp? Well, he always said at least you were something, as long as you could stand it. I want to worship something bigger than me or I'm lost. It must be the music, but not always. Not at 3 in the afternoon. Only an idiot sings always. My acts are all bad, Mimi. What about that? I have no imagination for a good act. Am I dead? I guess I'm normally courteous. So are the dead. Max wants to see a chariot of fire or light one himself. These poets keep wanting to suck the water out of the ocean with a straw. The boys were all driven out. It was hard to hide a car painted like this. But they did not want to see their new stepfather. They had seen their father for the first time since they were 6 and 7 and wished had stayed longer. Though to them, Canada was just one of many places farther away than Sharkey County. He never heard about the car, and they knew nobody was in favor of small boys owning and driving such a machine. They imagined ogres of many types lost just behind them in their smoke, but nobody had gotten close. High speed over the gravel at the penultimate velocity, over rocks like low shoals of water. The amateurs are dead behind you. This is how the boys felt, and they had gone back to Benson Hedges, long ones. They were also hidden in the last dry purchase of the swamp behind Raymond and Mimi's house. They waited until evening to announce themselves. Looking for Mimi's titties through the window seemed beneath them now. They loved her singing too much. They sought her now because they were much growner. They had traded their mother for a car, and Harold was all the father they had left. Lately Harold was picking up wheel rims and flexing with sledgehammers for his strength regimen. He ate 2 steaks and salads at a time. His acne went away, and he had found chemicals in the Big Mart pharmacy that cut and bulked you out. These were expensive, but the boys saw he did have a better body. They did not take pity on their mother's private needs. Nor were they aware that she liked Harold in the least, which she did. He had even begun higher mechanics at the trade school. He brought down the swearing in the house. He threatened to play games with the boys. He was not proud of providing these children with such a garish rocket. His break labor, his theft, which still had to be paid for. He cringed now when he thought he could get away with the switch. One was a car, the other a hulk of gummy decay. Yet he was a husband, and Dee was patient with him. Under other circumstances he would have been glad the boys were gone again. Dee liked her boys more, but there was something smaller about her. She wondered if marriage to this stern young man would mean much to her living world, such as it was. She was always away in her visions now. She saw men burning, crying out, and now children, great filthy explosions, deep and shallow water in which there were corpses, all in the shell of big mott, bombed and half covered by water. Men cried for water and ran up to her, and she spat fire at them. This was a vision, but it had a sleepiness to it, as if it were being carried on by her closed eyes into night dreams. She began watching the color television that Mortimer had given her long ago, asking that it imagine her, because she was afraid. She had great anxiety, and the sight of Harold in his school clothes, with loafers and sweaters, would send her into such a foreign mood she could not imagine how to address this young stranger, the boy naked in the bed beside her. The boys were good fishermen when they bothered. Their gear was at the Lost Lake. It was a tiny oxbow lake 300 yards from the rear of the bad restaurant, whose food exhaust could be smelled still, even here. Nobody was home at the Raymonds, and they killed the time fishing, hardly saying a word. The boys had spincast reels and a new Shakespeare bait caster. Bless all the gambling failures and crack addicts, a man could really shop in the pawn. Were the laws not just a little too stiff, you'd probably have found used children there. The boys kept the rods leaned to a tree at the little lake. They had discovered the place. Nobody else came. They cast with a single bait, never changing laws, the old lucky 13. If they could not hear the pop and see the strike of a big bass, they had no interest in catching one at all. They took 5 good bass in an hour. One of them was 9 pounds. They did not eat much fish, and they released the others back into the black-green water. Then went back to their car, worn and with tight smiles. If they could see Mimi Suarez, it would be a fine day. They could go home soon. There must have been 5 orphans in that one tree watching us. Thinking were the car desperados. Didn't think we'd even notice. They scared the devil out of me, but I just kept on throwing, said Isaac. They were glad to be desperados, watched in secret by city children. The orphans were going outside the camp at will, several of them armed. Harold and Spence were hunkered down at the rim of the sinkhole, staring down at where the car had been. They watched and watched, as if the mother and son would come back to it, open the trunk in its mud and slip in again, so that their minds could get back to the moment and begin making order. They were grave robbers, but who was it cared so much? Egan and Mortimer. Who cared so much that this 48 Hulk was swapped with another decent 48 Mortimer? Who was after Jacob and Isaac in their custom-made red and gold teenage car Mortimer? Now they heard through Egan, who'd invited the newlyweds to church services, that Pedden had whipped the hell out of Mortimer, who had come at him with a bat. But Hare was haunted by his own romance. In his serious college clothes, Hare was turning Christian under the influence of Egan. He and Dee attended church now. About this time Harold lowered his head, and a high-grain bullet of less caliber than a .22, called a B, parted his hair and lifted it. They were not aware they were being shot at from an immense distance, and the pops seemed irrelevant to the tragic hole they now studied. There was no blood, but a curious burn down the part of Harold's hair. He could not account for this. He had been mad with lust and plans. Now that he was preaching to Dee, he was wild with guilt. He trembled when he recalled the bones still with meat on them, the unreported dead. It took a sort of Jesus to remember them, with that sweet smell, the ligaments draped down from the sockets. He heard the child screaming from his head wound once the wind started. They sat on different pews. Pedden and Egan argued with Max Raymond about who owned a church. You couldn't just buy them, although this one, owned by Reformed Presbyterians, was very much for sale by its richer child in Vicksburg. Raymond was going to buy it. He had promises of money and a CD with his wife and band that was going somewhere. The band was ebbing at the casino, but they were getting gigs as far as Biloxi and New Orleans now. He had found some old doctor money he had forgotten from his old drug days when he feared the worst at every turn. It was quite a lot. The firm paid you even for being high and invested wisely for you. Funny, the way he didn't care for money and yet fell into it. You can buy a church. And you'd have to let me in if I bought it, said Raymond. We'd let you in anyway. The definition of a church is open, isn't it? Asked Byron Egan. He looked at Pedden because the jumpman was nervous, his cheeks jumping. Nobody denies the wanderer, said Pedden. This didn't seem quite on the mark. The three men shut up a while. My emphasis would always be on acts, not chats, said Raymond. I have turned around on this matter and go against Luther and the rest, I know. I'm not sure there was ever even a sect of me. Offshot from infide solar. You can have a church without firm belief, is all I'm saying. Most churchmen can't tell you what they believe anyway. All right, Egan said. Christ himself said whoever is not against us is on our part, and he might know the church. By it. We stand. I and Pedden have a church and the doors are wide open, for none of us knows who lives tomorrow, who may tarry yet come the sun dead on his pillow, Pedden burst out. He rose from the pew as if delivering an involuntary oath and strode toward the trombonists gently tuning in the little chair gallery to the left of the pulpit. These 5 men were dark black and were cousins. They had no interest in recording or selling their music. Many said they blended like the best tea of heaven, and they could make you cry with their hymns. Only one reader note of music, and he was not the leader. The leader was James. He played the enormously belled bass trombone. 2 others had valved trombones. So intense were these men in their harmonies that there seemed no other world for them. Now the trombonists stopped and looked at Pedden as if he were a goat wandering into their music. Say, men, asked Max Raymond, with his instrument case between his legs, you think I could sit in with you a few tunes, James? No. The men, dropping the saliva out of their spit valves, looked at one another. It ain't no place to make your entrance, said James. Nor get out if you was in. It be in there like a piece of hair on a bar of soap, said another seriously. They were musicians, but much like deacons too. They frightened Raymond a little. They began playing again, silvery, in trouble and then deliverance. One of them with the bell of his horn under the church light going gold to bronze to red. Christ, we are your throat. 15. Mortimer and Sidney met in the bait store after hours. Sidney's emporium was prosperous now. It needed both Opal and Iona, his new helper. A yellow Lexus sports wagon was parked behind the store. Sidney watched Mortimer with pleasure. Thin, bent, elderly in almost every movement. Pain on his face. The pretty boy homesick from school. When all was clear, they went out and told the girls to exit the Lexus newly stolen from Sevierville, Tennessee. It was yellow with a cream-white grille in front. It was a little girl's car, in fact. Mortimer put on a CD in the jam box. The girls had done this before. The music was elvish dancing music that Mortimer had gotten at a bargain in the mall. Nobody had ever bought it. It was a junior college symphony from Kansas. The orphans, Betsy and Irma, began by holding hands and skipping together in the aisles of the heavily stocked store, knocking over flashlight batteries, sardines, bananas. Since Sidney had restocked, you could see the equipment for much iniquity. Magazines about muscular naked girls. The girls walked to the tunes and disrobed privately behind a far aisle. They were not certain how to carry on, but the elvish meadow dance music urged them onward, and they came out demurely in nothing. Mortimer cheered them to continue to dance. No hand touched them. It was an arrangement by the artist in his last creative fever. He and Sidney watched from padded chairs. They shared a single malt Scotch bottle between them. Fart bait house glasses to drink from. They seemed to desire nothing else. They were not anxious but meditative. Once Sidney accidentally touched Mortimer's arm reaching for his drink, and Mortimer's knife hand flew to his back pocket. But there was nothing there, the movement was involuntary. At the end they gave the girls money and said it was a very fine audition. This was the form of Mortimer's current sin. Sydney was the more lecherous of the two and had gotten tight enough to hold the shoulder of the child Betsy. But this act was so repellent to her that she almost fainted, so he left her alone to return to the yellow Lexus and home to Clinton, where they had pallets and a large television in a vacant room, with snacks and sodas and their own phone in Mortimer's very teenage hangout. Melanie, Bernice and John Roman ate at the Rib House, near enough food. Its theme was medieval chaos, and people dumped buckets of ribs on a tablecloth of butcher paper, then tore off a length from the top and bagged the rib bones in preparation for the next arrivals. It was festive and harsh, and a success. Employees of the bad restaurant ate here. The face of Frank Booth passed by a window, and Roman was shocked again by the surgeon's ability to bring a third Conway-Twitty into the world. He reached for his big rib knife, a heavy steel thing, and awaited Booth's appearance at the door. Booth came in the door with Ruthner and the very drunk Wit and Alexander. Ruthner was not drinking and looked cleanly figured, getting some of her womanly curves back. Melanie admired her and thought she had seen her around the lake. Bernice was deeply affected by Melanie, who had stayed close to her through the illness, even though Roman sometimes had doubts about the lady's curious goodness. His reservations were gone now. He saw she could not help being a good woman, and he was sorry for her pain as an old lover. He was a happier man now that Bernice was back among the living, but the Booth man hovered near him, and the women noticed him too. "Is he that singer, or isn't he?" asked Melanie. "A bridge that just won't burn, he's bald now. Doesn't he wear a hairpiece when he comes here to eat? That is not Conway-Twitty. That is another man who looks like him." "And it ain't right," said Roman. "My word." With the woman and her poor drunken friends. The group of them sat down at a near table. Wit and Alexander had brought brown bags with liquor in them, allowed on dry Sunday evenings. The bald man with Twitty's face was paying serious court to Ruthner. He was touching her face and being most solicitous about her hair and comfort as she combed away at a snarl. He seemed to be feeling just capital, but there was an appalling quality to this, seeing a dead singer making time with Ruthner, just back from the dead herself and nearly as pale as her drunk mates. These men had not turned into mean drunks yet, a miracle for the decades they had been lushes. They sweated and carped merrily, waiting on the fat ribs, the cowgirl wenches, the huge fruit jar glasses with ice and lemon set-ups. Melanie saw that Ruthner was not as ardent as Booth, but she was not disinterested. Roman snorted. "Skank. You ain't the total darling you once were," said Bernice. His healthy wife. He could hardly believe she was here. Maybe he suffered from Mortimer for her life. That night of the masks. Her pain had seemed to have had no reason, her waiting, his watching. He could not keep his eyes off Booth's face. He felt lifted from his seat, memory throbbing in his wrist. The thing, as if warned, turned and beheld him directly. "Help me," the lips seemed to form. Roman held his rib knife tensely, poised. The women were scared and jittery now, including Ruthner, who seemed at last to recognize the mask of her date. Ulrich and Egan were visiting Pedden in his house by the junkyard. Pedden now had a gun. He rested in different rooms. He had reports of Mortimer in good humor but scrawny, aged. Lloyd drove for him almost always. Eddie gave him rub-downs in Clinton and Rowing Fork. She was showing her age too. Maybe she was back on the Valium. Spence had only his stepfather Harold's connection to Pedden when they stole the 48 together. They knew the call for the car was out and that Mortimer intended to hurt somebody about this matter. The boys had not come home at all since their mother's wedding weeks ago. They might be legal drivers before they were seen again. That or dead in the trunk of their 48. Spence could hardly stay at home with Dee and Harold. He did not understand his own position there anymore. There was no family left, only the marriage, a queer thing that seemed to make his mother weaker and Harold officious, strutting and lecturing Spence about life, now that he was almost a graduate of the mechanics college. Spence became a wanderer with no home and barely a car, only Harold's old Chevrolet El Camino with its truck bed and car cab. It smelled like very lonely oil men. It looked like their wallets inside. A web of rusted veins ran all about. It had a good engine, but sleeping in it was hard when he quit playing like he was training for the Air Force. But where could he go? He went into the orphans' woods and walked, knowing they were all around him from across the canal around their island fortress, and he held a rifle as if he were an idle hunter of deer perhaps lost. He sought their company, but he did not know how to acknowledge them. He wanted a confrontation so he could shout out his innocence, but he fled when nobody pursued. He walked himself into a ragged, hungry thing. By the time he made it to Pedden's house, he was stunned, sleepy, a scarecrow driving a car from the era of 8-track tapes. But he stumbled onto the porch and held out his hand. "I come to give myself up. Have a seat, boy. Could I have some of that coffee? I don't want to put you out. Come on in." We were all having some. I been everywhere. Im wore out by 3 counties. But im telling what I know. "What did you think we wanted to hear?" asked Egan. The boy worried him with his hungry look. "You been looking for your little brothers?" Partly. Just stopping by. How you do? Ship in a storm. Winter is cold and wet and dull. On old Mortimer he might not care about much. How the woman at the store said. He gambles some, but he don't care. He's like kind to animals. He is put in Ulrich. Then we could be friends. We could be eagles together. Egan and Pedden looked at Ulrich, a benign affliction, standing plump in his suspenders in front of the wood stove. Sandals over big wool socks. Vast assless pants. He smiled at Spence, and Spence knew him for a father. Pedden relaxed from the news in this boy's narrative. He put his arm around the boy's neck, smelled the oil and sweat, drew back. Pedden was from nowhere people in Pocahontas, and his formative years were much staring at kudzu, wondering how it could be faster than him or his Uncle Ed and do whole school grades in just one summer. He knew this boy better than he knew himself. He crossed the room and raised his pistol, only a .22 but a buntline barrel on her hollow points, long rifle. The illusion of self-defense. It looked like a gun. "We've got a choice here. I'm not worried about that car. I'm worried about your brothers." "But Brother Spence, can I have a gun and love Christ?" "You asking me?" asked Spence. "Yes, I do. Or have. Christ used a whip on the money men, turning the temple into a money changer. Let me ask you this, then. Where is the temple?" Spence couldn't answer. "You want to get a bath and clean clothes while I'm making you some tamales and you think about it." "Yes, sir, I do. A man has to sleep with as many animals as possible," Ulrich blurted. "But not in the sexual way. By no means. An execration. No. Just get in the bed there with them, invite them on in, know their smell and their cold nose. You smell the good dirt in their fur. Fur is individual. No two alike, like a snowflake. It ought to be a state law." The others listened, but he was through and at peace. It occurred to Egan that every one of them in the room was old beyond his years except Ulrich, who looked like a stupid, lined boy. Harried and singed into senescence, red in the eyes, the rest. They were rushing to die. She called him into the room to watch her die, but then said she didn't want him to suffer and tried to send him out. The moment was vague, but the nurse told him she was gone. So Harvard's wife, Nita, died in their bedroom in their house, a large stone one overlooking the lake and a front lawn full of century pine trees 80 feet tall. Isaac and Jacob lived in Harvard's front room now. The 48 was parked behind the garage. That muddy grass car. These strange boys he had pulled off the roads with some order of new strength. How he loved them. They loved Nita, and she smiled at them the last week too. Harvard did not have deep thoughts the 2 days her body was gone to prepare for the funeral. He would drive her in the pleasure barge to the church in the glen, where Egan would preach the funeral for a woman he had never seen, and Harvard would ask himself, where the hell have I taken us when this man Egan stands at the gates facing either direction? He had useless thoughts and intense ones, such as the storms that gathered then left, so you wondered were the same storms simply circling the lake, such as nobody has ever left home. Nobody has brought news back from anywhere. Every awful scene rotates to somebody else, and they will not believe it either. Nita, honey, 52 years with you. Married in 48, so I had to have the car too, along with the boys. This may be a miracle, something meant beyond my plans. I hope so. It felt like it. Without the boys I'd now be dead, I think. He thought of Melanie. It sometimes happens that the wife outlives her husband by 30 years. But more often, too, he hated God for putting Melanie Wooten there in the years of his wife's suffering. Melanie, to be looked upon, enjoyed in the abstract, comparing always too favorably with Nita. Even I can believe in God if I hate enough, please, to spit in somebody's face. To the few who knew he had the boys, their mother, the sheriff, a couple of the inner circle of sane oldsters, he offered no apology. He had to have them, that was all. He found a pistol and some shells in their car. He was not certain who wanted to harm them or needed this car so much. They were cloudy on it themselves. He drove them to school, the pistol on the floor under his seat, handy. If the killer gave him time to get it out while he stood there like a sack of salt with a bullseye on it. They would stay there 2 months while the couple honeymooned and the stepfather got established, Harvard said. The car was stolen, and he wondered if anybody was seeking it. He helped them wash it, but he would not let them drive it. Harvard and the boys talked, wearing suits and carrying Nita in the repute common galley behind the wheel of the barge. Just them alone with the casket, the stained glass around it deep purple with greens and yellows. Harvard had done a magnificent job, as if it were all for Nita, bless her, after the waiting and torture. Way over across the lake, insectile mourners stood on the shore of the glen waiting for the boat, Harvard's handcrafted tribute. Nita now in dignity denied her by the suffocation of her last months. Pain that will have it out with a good person until the person hates herself, loved ones trying even harder to love and deny the confusion. The tiny mourners stood in back of a church newly painted and air-conditioned. Plain, with little trim and a squared Georgian softness collected by its steeple. It was Raymond's church now, and the old cemetery next to it was clean and fenced and greenish. Mortimer saw the barge pass below the bait store and wanted it all over again. He loved the elegant and slow now. The machines that had never rushed him, the old carriages that had never harried him, the tender old verities, but what were they, things like church dogs, football, children wrestling in the glen. Those good people. Not a finer man in the county than your postman daddy, what's his name, and your mother the post lady, the chicken lover. Mortimer had a club already. Pals. Women to look at or pet him. It was good to be off the cock farm in many ways. This cool point of view where beauty in women shriveled back to what it was actually worth. You stick with Eddie, Bertha, Marcine. Good country people, trustworthy. You got a rich old fool in a handmade boat and had what Mortimer wanted back, the good past. The times that woman had taken from him, 8 years back. It was time to sit back and smell the room. Harvard never cared for him. Understated aristocrat, somebody said. His lake, his thin hands. His wife died on him anyway. Mortimer knew he had graduated into old, which made him new blood, the youngest of the old. It was strangely good to know this. He could start having an overview, seeing he was always meant for the center. Neither the chills nor the fevers of before. Maybe I cut because I want them to have no face too. Because if you've got somebody else's face, you never had one, there ain't no memory of you. Pidden had taken his youth. He was given little choice. Mortimer had come in the window with a club, a mistake he would not have made earlier on. He imagined Peden was weak and easy because he'd seen him drinking just the day before. Maybe I should burn Pedden's house and him in it. He's got nowhere else. Even if it failed, it would flush him. He needs to be in my club. We can meet and talk about nothing but faces. A support group. Name it. What am I? Chopped liver. Get on public access or PBS. Shoot the show with the junkyard in the background. Close-up of scars and sharp metal edges. My people. Here, let's see your face and its problems. Would you get a light on that? Oh lordy. Too bad they don't still have elevator jobs or folks that live in belfries. Booth entered his mind, and he turned on Pepper's old stool, where he lounged while Sidney was at the funeral. He suddenly thought Pepper stood behind him. He was shaken, all alone here in the store. I give surgeons work, he thought. I take the vanity out of my friends' lives. I make them face the music of their essential selves. Oh, it's hard to be sincere these days. All these things I have done, and yet my work seems never to be over. Because this lake is mine and I didn't realize it. I am expanding without panic or even plans. There's many a little girl to be friends with out there. The ones that won't rush you. My video work. A man that stays busy ain't ever in trouble. He looked about the store at all these expensive devices for pulling spiny, scaly meat out of the water. He didn't understand it. Never had. Even doctors and rocket scientists at it. He was limp with innocence. He was no longer planning. Just heard a voice in his ear, getting louder. Booth, I'll cut your throat where you stand, and I don't never have to ask why you look like this now. I could've done it before at the ball game. I let you go. You hearing me? But he had nothing on him to cut with, and the nearest pocket knife 15 feet away on the wall. What he loved now was a Pakistani 3/4 machete with a brown, green and yellow handle and golden gills on the blade. But it was in the car and remained only an exquisite hypothesis even when it was in his hands. His own pool, his houses, his spirit. When he was certain nobody was in the store, he said to himself, hardly anybody does anything by hand anymore. It was a strange, vacant, bright day, this funeral day for Nita Harvard. Not a speck of a man or woman, not a single fishing boat out there on the water. The wind was out of the east and the fishermen knew it was hopeless. We come to begin a church and send away a neighbor to what this church and all love is about, began Byron Egan. The trombones had just quit, and unknown mourners were present just for them, the band without even a name. Brown, yellow, black faces posing as friends of Nita and Harvard, or now of her corpse. Nita had never been a mingler even when healthy. Egan had had a difficult time with this one, and he felt he was turning into liquid in front of Max Raymond, harsh witness, and his lot. She did not go to church, he said, but Nita Harvard, what I hear about her, lived a life that deserves a cathedral. Her sense of humor, her fairness, made life more lovely and lively for those around her. What else can we demand of a neighbor? Flowers, tennis, a life graceful and generous. Even so, old fool cancer got in her and really tried to lay her low. But now where is she? High in a new church, launched toward heaven with its new friends and old. At first Harvard thought it might be a sort of tag team eulogy, with Pedden stepping up, but this man only brought a tape of Nita's favorite tunes. I'll be seeing you, what's new? These went across nicely on a big Sony Jambox, and the funeral was over except for the churchyard cemetery with its small tent over her loamy slot. She had barely looked at the church while living. She practiced a distanced Episcopalianism and did not especially like people. Mortimer could see the church, a white thimble across the bumpy water blown easterly from the bait house. Somebody he was talking to and hustling years ago told Mortimer there was a town at the bottom of the lake. He thought of his own town in Missouri. He imagined it underwater. His parents' hair straining upward, circled by the corpses of suspended chickens. His parents were wearing their postal outfits. Stupid in this fixed image, they had a kind of hopeless love on their faces and no opinion at all. They neither cursed God nor acknowledged him. In death, if they were in fact dead, they carried on, changing nothing, being nothing, walking their grey lives along the rut in the ground. Mortimer could live on no middle ground. The fact that his last fight had reduced him nearly to ectoplasm terrified him. He had a nostalgia for himself. Now he toiled with the binoculars and cursed eagles who intervened between his eyes and the pleasure barge. Harvard manned the boat, still alone with the boys on his way back to the cove dock. He did not want travelers. This was duly noted by half his friends, who had dressed less for the funeral than for the pontoon yacht ride and were ignored. Some had worked on the new craft and were angry. There can be no second maiden voyage, and having to wait on the shore struck them as rude and unfair. They watched these yard pups go solemnly with him in their new littleman's suits. Many groused. Mortimer, with the big Pakistani blade, walked slowly, bently down to the cove. He saw the willow sticks budding where the snakes had lain, where he had fallen and shrieked. The pontoon boat chugged without hurry its 3 miles. The boys had never had this view, and it made them children again, knowing where they lived from the water's point of view. They felt tiny and good. They were proud of themselves for holding out against this waving mass their long years. "Heidi," said Mortimer from the winter willows, "you ain't trying to land on my side of this lake over here, are you?" They saw the big blade and were only 30 feet from his face. The head was floating toward them, the singer's tall waved grey hair and the smaller creased face. He might now be Earl Clyde, lounge hawker and crooner, 65 and still going, reaching deeper and deeper into his throat for a tune. They saw the blade, but then only his shoes, a spangling black pair of opera slippers. Could they be? Only Harvard knew what they were and doubted his eyes. Who could remember a gun in the launch amid boarding his wife's casket, the funeral, the suiting up of the boys, the pouts of old friends when they couldn't come aboard, the sermon and music by bike scum, one of them with a black tattooed cross on his cheek? Who could remember? The boys had the pistol. They had never forgotten. Isaac raised it, the original bullets in it. 5 of the 8 went off, but the child was no shooter. So he got Mortimer only once through the earlobe on the left, which hurt a great deal. His hand went to his ear and he howled briefly, the blade spinning as he let it go, nicking him across the shin. Harvard saw a great deal of smoke for such a small black gun. He could not believe any of the 5 shots had hit nearly what was meant by it. He wheeled the boat into the dock, but was all over the place, like a semi-trailer on ice, berthing it. He recalled the head shrieking in the willow sticks, and now the thin body beneath and the opera slippers dancing on the early spring grass. The thing went up the hill like a black goat. The boys were fascinated. Mortimer was so much littler, benter. He could not move very fast, but he loped now to his car, holding his ear. Harvard docked the boat with their help on the lines. He was having a stupid dream in which the boys were not at fault. He wasn't over the shock of Isaac firing the weapon. He was no longer particularly sad or angry. Melanie, outside her kitchen door, looked down to them with a hand over her eyes against the western sun. She waved. She was dressed well, in black. He didn't know whether she had been to the funeral, but he had been conscious of her the entire day, released to feel what he would. 16. In the bait store the parents of Man Mortimer were waiting. Lloyd, Eddie and little Marcine were in the store too, with the elder Mortimers, who had just shown up at the car agency. They had come in a long old Ford wagon with canaries caged in the back. The gang was fascinated. Mortimer ignored the long car, which had wandered slowly and sadly but stubbornly down from Missouri. When he burst in all sick and bloody and woofing, his short grey parents quailed, anxious in their thick spectacles, leisure wear, hard shoes. They would have worn stilts had that been the style when they were 30. The father spoke. "We'd heard you were doing so well. We were going to ask you up to Branson to hear a concert with us. Before we die. The Oak Ridge boys are back to doing gospel." Then the father saw the blood, the muddy patent of the opera slippers. He saw Mortimer was not right for a concert right now and was not young. Just a scratch, Mortimer insisted. He had shot himself hunting for snakes, had gotten bored and went down to get himself a few snakes. He guessed he was old enough to think about those nasty old guns now, but had forgotten how they could turn on you. Had learned his lesson. Only got 3 small snakes anyhow. He felt a boy in front of these elders sick and pouted out puffy. Big Lloyd came outside, where Harvard waited with the boys at the bottom of the steps. In their suits they seemed to have trailed Mortimer to be of service. And in fact they brought his great Pakistani knife to him, muddy at the golden gills. "Is that your sword?" asked Lloyd of Harvard, who held it like a trowel. "He dropped this knife thing on the ground when he was hurt," said Jacob. They handed the gaudy medieval blade over to Lloyd. They seemed a crew of pleasant neighbors doing what they could. Lloyd, huge and bald in a tan leather suit. "You can go home, and I know Mr. Mortimer will thank you. He don't have to get anywhere nigh that close," said Jacob. "We ain't got a home anyway. He don't seem like he used to be when he was our mamma's boyfriend and had all this money and a different car every week. He ain't old and ruined or anything, is he? Don't you worry. He's the same. He's had some bad luck." "Is he shot in the ear or the head?" "Only the ear, son." "Well, see you now. It was an accident." "I know that. He told us." Lloyd went in, closing the door. Marcine then came out on the steps. She was 17 but looked 21, pleasantly dressed like a secretary to a spangling carriagency showroom, which Bertha was training her to be. Her hair was naturally brown and full and French cut. She thought she knew the boys and the grandfather guy. "You boys live here?" "No." "What house?" "We got many houses." "Nature. Porches. Sleeping bags. On the water. Wherever." "You dress in suits a lot." "There was a funeral. His wife. I express my regrets. I bet she was pretty and kind." Marcine looked across the short valley and saw Melanie Wooten standing on her kitchen walk and holding her white hair with one hand in the breeze, still looking Harvard's way, concerned. But in her church funeral outfit, black with white pearls at her neck. That woman didn't die. "That's good," thought Marcine, stunned by this vision across the tops of the sycamores and giant willows. She loved Melanie even more for still living. The points of early spring greening around her. Inside, man Mortimer was mellow, gracious even. A fresh towel to his ear, he was expatiating on the foolishness of guns, their cowardice, their chicken distances to things, the modern cheap craven world. With adrenal glands open yet flooding away, he asked his seated parents whose old Ford wagon that was out there. "It's ours," said his mother. She was uneasy. There is no behavior for a woman in a bait store unless she fishes. The racks of prophylactics near Mother Mortimer were huge, next to brassy naked covers of magazines in plastic thermal seals. Vixen eyes of large destruction. "Well, get your birds and bags out for Lloyd. Hell, drive it in the lake tomorrow. I've got something else for you. Like new. I'm putting you up at the Casino Hotel, first class, long as you want. All my houses are under construction, repairs. But we'll give a party. A fine band. We don't have to travel to Branson, Missouri, to any concert. Good as the Oaks are. They'll be by here soon, unless they find out you're here and too wild for 'em." They did not pick up on this joke, but he was their boy all over again. Mortimer felt this too, and this time he liked it, wounded, hiding his fury. "Son, you're badly hurt," said his father. His mother touched him. She had been cleaving to her husband. Eddie, middle-aged but with long good legs, got Mortimer out the door and drove him to the clinic, then home to Rowing Fork. "Man comes back soon, Mrs. Mortimer. Don't worry. His business is big. Big, big. It wears on him, but he's a blue steel spring," said Lloyd. When Sydney at last came in the store, half-drunk and full of funeral gossip, Mortimer's parents and Lloyd and Marcine had gone. But he saw the blood on the floor and heard tales from Pete Wren, who knew little but shared it anyway. He did know that Mortimer was hurt and that his parents had come down for him. "He's getting weaker." "I could own it all," Sydney whispered. In a black Ford Expedition, alone, was Bertha, dead now. The windows were smoked, nobody knew for a long while she was there. She had swallowed Valiums and barbiturates with a cold quart of Country Club. Saliva webbed down her chin. She just couldn't take it anymore. Her age, who she was holding the smiles till her cheeks hurt, leading Marcin into the life. Several hours would pass before any thought to find her, because she was like good old furniture to hand. She was cordial always, yet a quiet one too, and well dressed and combed to the end. Pedden wanted her badly. He thought to save her and missed by one day. Their date would have been the day after Nita's funeral. Gone. Blood now to her belly and the rigor passing through the smile. Harvard backed the barge away from the pier and the boys, ever quick, helped on the lines. They wanted to drive, but he was making them watch carefully. He was afraid of being close to Melanie, so they sailed downshore to his own lawn and berthed on the grass. Although the launch was mainly his project, there were several zealous pilots and many of them keen to impress their own friends who were gathered to this beauty. But Harvard did not care. He would have his grief and his boys. They went first to the room where Nita had died and took the flowers to all parts of the house so they could see them while they ate and talked. Another funeral at the church, preached by Byron Egan. Pedden, heartbreaking, was not allowed in. Egan did not want him to see Lloyd, Eddie, Marcin, the other whores and re-ivers, black and white car thieves wearing white socks with suits and thick rubber-soled cross-trainers. Speed and grip. Pedden sat outside in the bleak blue Nissan. He listened through a window and held his gun. Many robins got in the church from the trees and roosted among the congregation. They were drunk from some berries and fallen persimmons. Come into the mead hall out of the chill. In Viking history, once a Christian described human life as the flight of a bird through the mead hall, the outerness afterward eternity. The relations of Bertha sat in one sullen and miserable huddle in the front pews. Ronnie the body shop man was among them, barely recognizing his old girlfriend Marcin. Man Mortimer and his parents sat right behind them, concerned and prim in black and white mourning clothes newly bought in town. This was not New Orleans, where they knew best how to mourn drug addicts, evening ladies and jazz mothers. This place had none of that city's archaeology of concentrated sin. Bertha's casket was open because she was at peace and made lovely by the beautician's touch. The beautician was her weeping but fastidious cousin Elka, who wanted in the Mortimer business. She wanted to take Bertha's place and knew well what she did besides shift car papers. She knew she could be tough and loved to fornicate anyhow. Elka wore white and pink today and sat near a quartet with whom she was committing three-cornered adultery. Elka used to run in a circle of lower Delta Party girls who performed on crop dusters while they were flying and poisoning just for the memory. Under the telephone wires, up quick. Then down for the gin and costume ball of the Scots in Panther Burn, or dynamiting with bachelors in Robinsonville, making new homes in old levees and Indian mounds where whole old guys might come out and their pots. Sidney Fart was in attendance to pick up his rumors. Many thought Bertha had killed herself because Sidney had been with her, and Sidney spread this rumor around as fact. Frank Booth sat beside Ruthner, motionless. She had told him she knew Bertha and really loved her, had once roomed with her at the Olympics in Atlanta. Booth was there for Ruthner, and to confront Man Mortimer with what he was now, a Conway twitty face fresher than Mortimer's own, unlined. Nobody knew what Booth had on his mind, although Eddie, who always carried a North American .22 Magnum Derringer, promised to blow his head off if he came near Mortimer in his feeble condition and knew black here, especially with his parents visiting or maybe even come to live, and he was surviving by their ignorant ministrations as he brought them here and there to bits of his empire in the lower Delta and in Vicksburg. They were amazed the river was so wide, having never expended the energy to look at it directly in Missouri. They recalled only fearing it and now feared it more. They were 80. They had retired in good financial condition, but it meant little to them with no son, no hobbies and the new small house. No chickens inside city limits anymore. They had been sad for 30 years and wondered how especially terrible they were that he had run away from them. They went to church often and desperately and watched Help Me on television, in case he called out or somebody found them. Now they had found him. They dreamed separately that man Mortimer was not a nice person, and they tried to force a good dream about him, but it would not come. Then they began to remember how selfish a child he had been. Yet their love loved this too. They recalled that he was vicious, calculating and secretive, and they could see right through his present act, yokels that they were, and parents at this very funeral. His counterfeited sorrow for Bertha. Still they loved. It was too late not to love, and it did not matter any more where they themselves were. It was having him close, that was what life was for in the end. It mattered not where they slept. They barely wrinkled the bedspreads in the gold bowl room he got for them, mermaids on the wallpaper. Mrs. Mortimer's canaries thrived. The maid found the Mortimers so lost she took them on as a project. And they must help him, their son. It was very intimate here, at the Church of Open Doors, open for the lost and dead of all causes. Raymond sat next to Mimi, his temples grey now and growing hair behind, as if to take up the ponytail Egan had shaved. He was disconsolate near the man who had stabbed him. He had tried to forgive him, but not very hard. He wished to be taken into a different room of heaven with Mortimer's blood on his hands. He did not require whole salvation, just a little table with books and coffee, pens and paper, the saxophone. Now Mortimer was little and sick. The monster Lloyd was close to him. Raymond hid his murderous thoughts from Mimi, who had dressed up to hide her impatient body. Long dress, lapels. She had no allegiances here. She was weary of Raymond, weary of the band, of herself, of the lake. Why were they still here? Then she remembered. They had no money. Even nature palled when you had no money. Nature was without religion sometimes when you looked at it poor, and all the creatures seemed bedraggled and begging, hardly getting by. You saw a fat one and wondered. Where was she getting her orders? They had the church. Then there was other money coming, the CDs, but that had proved a more difficult game than Raymond thought. He would always find some money somewhere, she believed. Mortimer seemed comfortable sitting by his parents, perhaps enjoying his slide to invalidism, or coiling tighter. He did not know how to act at a funeral, so he looked tragic, but the effect was that of lurid grinning. Egan saw this, and the face almost ruined his eulogy, which was that Bertha was quiet and unknown as in Gray's elegy in a country churchyard, and that she hurt even in her prosperity like Richard Cory, the suicide who had it all, as others cursed their bad bread and envied him. Did God accept suicides? There was a case for his own son's hesitant suicide on this earth. And so much cloudiness here as to shut up the meaner of us who wanted to keep souls out of heaven. Heaven was many houses, very big and wide. Many mansions, many houses, as the Saviour promised us, or he would not have told us so in his words. Many and large. May heaven rest her soul in a home she can decorate at leisure, Egan said. Some of the crowd laughed, most didn't care, but loved a good send-off where you met others who were horny from close death like you, among food and drink afterward. 4 were simply dying for a smoke and had no opinion right now of God or the century just past or Bertha. Bertha's mother would weep later, with a Marlboro light inhaled and going. Max Raymond suddenly knew his vision would come at the end of his life and not a moment before. He was nearly blinded by the realization that he was a nuisance to both God and man. He repented. He would act. He felt expendable to a higher power, and this was good. He was resigned but in no way sad. He thought of Bertha as she went now, and he prayed to her in that black paradise. Elsewhere Ulrich watched Melanie's greyhound. He couldn't get over it. He loved the face of this gentle beast, hunched as if alarmed by its own aerodynamics, its eyes sliding away, seeking affection as if its whole soul were poised on ice and betrayal lurked beneath each footfall. Of course Ulrich wept, but not too much. "Where do you live?" son Mortimer's mother asked. They were seated at a restaurant under the bluffs in Vicksburg. Beneath its foundation, it was said, were many who had received fire from Federal gunboats, who were losing to the rebel artillery very badly in 1863. Hundreds of bombs and cannonballs fired from the gunboats, many of them on fire or in other distress. Attack from the water was impossible, and even running the water was deathly. The river lit at night with all kinds of barrel flares and wrecks, perfect for gunners who could knock the heads off chickens at a mile. Lord God, war was fun for a while, till it crept up on you. Now the riverbed's mass grave held a high-beamed, white-planked bar and grill that served oysters, fish and pizzas, and fresh salads from gardens nearby, fine French bread twists. Mortimer liked the lassitude here in the ferns and shadowed glass, as if the dead boys dancing with death had built it just for him 135 years later in a flush Vicksburg, very paved and rolling. Thinking of those good boys and their wails really widened the head for thought. Mortimer looked benevolently at his mother, but this look was another unnatural one for him, and he wound up grinning like a coon. He didn't like to be alone with them because they were getting heavier on him with questions, since they knew nothing beyond their county. They had no life except breathe the old air and sleep again. Mortimer thought, I don't know anybody even nearly this old except the fools at the pier and Sydney, who was growing younger, curiously. I have several homes. The construction has been slowed by the rains. Why do you lie, son? It ain't rained, said his father. We don't care if you live in a palace or a doghouse. It has rained where they are. Fair in other counties, spread out. I haven't got them ready for guest occupation. Can't you wait? The Gold Bowl too racy for you? You're afraid of gamblers and performers getting under the door. No. We don't even want to go to your house except to be closer to you. That doesn't matter. We only want to know more about you and your life and friends. You know we have money. We have nothing but patience. We try to not even be here. I know that to you we are plants and hardly animals, son. Mortimer glanced up at his father in shock. Not a finer man in the county than what's his name, your postman, Dad. His mother came in. Yes. Why do you get shot? I don't get shot. I shot myself hunting snakes. We never saw no gun. We saw that weird chopping dagger. Don't lie again. We're old enough to smell out these stories. They don't save us anything painful. They're hard on us. They hurt. There's no cause for lies here. Even if you were a gangster, a car thief, or married to several women at once. We came to love and have you. All right. I'm a lot too old myself to have to tell everything to my folks. Mortimer spoke to the side of his parents' ready faces. I guess you always were. Old that way, answered his mother. They saw him now after long staring, and he didn't like it one bit. But on the other hand, he liked being the suspicious boy charged with secrets, staring out at the rain and the chickens with tears in his eyes. Sheriff Faisto and Melanie walked in along with Harold and Dee Allison. The married woman was using the last name Laird now, neither happy nor unhappy about the new echo of herself. D.A. Laird. They sat very close to Mortimer and his parents before they knew who was there, at booth 2 over near an aquarium of riverine life and the oyster bar. The parents remained unfazed when Dee and the others saw them. Bland mysteries, aged to the arrivals. They seemed too soft for him even now when he was ill and hurt. Perhaps they were his angels, his salt of the earth, as all men have somewhere. Or perhaps they were Midwestern corn money, that very serious corn money you heard about, come down to blow some at the casinos. The sheriff stared at Mortimer, and Mortimer knew he would do something merry and humiliating to this boy soon. He looked Dee over slowly as if he were a total devoted stranger, recalling their nights. Dee was looking nowhere, then suddenly directly at him. Harold had gained weight in his shoulders, his forearms were muscular, his brow and spectacles, new, were intent. Serious mechanic, his own business, his own solid woman. The sheriff wondered how Mortimer was hustling these old people of the Corn Belt. They dressed in checks and hard shoes. They might be creationists gambling for their church fund. He had encountered this oddness a few times. They won too. Seemed to have a system or better prayers. What changes the man had, even looking now like that lounge comic with the enormous head and hair, Brother Dave Gardner. Weird interpretations of the Bible, impressions of crashing yokels who couldn't handle technology. Harold was into a long declamation on mechanics, and it gave the sheriff time to think. His woman was drunk, and he was deeply in love with her. Her white hair was in some disorder, and he did not know what to do. He was adoring the world more and yet losing in the eyes of men, and this was plain in the sad look he gave himself in the mirror each morning as he combed his short hair. He wanted a smart marine look. Acting, he was a ham and never denied it. Several still loved him for it, especially women he did not respond to at all. The only one who moved him was Melanie Wooten. Maybe he was making up for his failure to save his mother from his father, who had them both cowed. He didn't care. He was at the end of his sheriff's term and opposed by a very tough dumb man with a history of penal administration. Hoover, who hooked put his posters up quick. Who despised Faisto. Crime was not particularly rampant, in fact it was calm, but Hoover insisted Faisto was lax. He wanted pawnshop spies, vigilante groups against whores parked in neighborhoods, did hooks. He derided Faisto as a schoolmommy dramatist whose body was in too good a shape for him to be doing his job. Who accused him of wearing man tan and shining his haircut. The subject of Melanie Wooten also had floated to Who, and a campaign of rumor began, to the effect that Faisto was deeply odd. Melanie was aware of her bad name, and she drank. Dee did not get around much anymore. She was a bit softer if not heavier. Inside she suffered high winds, terrible lightning and hail. She saw pictures that would not stop, the dead and wrecked, children, guns, high explosives, felt hellish thunder. She stared as if down a string of blocks through a town flattened by a tornado. She saw Mortimer holding an oyster on a tine, dipping it in Tabasco, hunting her with glances. Faisto could hardly believe this man had come toward him a few months before on a Norton Commander motorcycle like his own, in Mountie boots, laughing like a twin. The man who had wanted to join the non-existent launch club after he fell shrieking into the snakes. Dee Melanie asked brightly, "How's your thing? I mean, when you really get down to it, we old things want to keep up." Dee smiled for the first time in the evening. Mortimer's table had heard. "Is she a harlot?" whispered his father. "She's my woman," whispered Mortimer. "The younger one. The old lady's just drunk and lively. She can't stay away, Dee Allison. Married now, but we belong together." They were relieved truly, that he had at last confessed to something clandestine. They had made way. They were loving him. "Is there a tragedy in this situation?" asked his mother. She looked like an old pie somebody had drawn in, he thought. Mortimer's empire was collapsing, reduced to a showroom of fairly new SUVs with some older models stolen from the coasts and Chicago. Some women, 29 actually, roaming 3 counties. A junkyard prosperous for junkyards. He wandered to his houses and they did not comfort him. The larger screen television in his Bear Clinton home. "I got to get Pedden where he lives," he vowed. "I see him letting his debt to me go, as if it was cancelled when he whipped me. Who will I be serving in my older years?" he thought suddenly. "Where will I be still home, counting my money and wondering what to give it to maybe the orphans? I could go straight and healthy after all this, I could make it. Just thinking of it makes me feel better. Using my talents, growing toward a light. Old history around here, and history itself must feel uncomfortable a right good part of the time. It's been good brooding here at the table, staring at Dee and hearing that old lady drunk. The world turning new for you. The world's a little thing," he concluded as his cognac came. "Pedden owes me and he lost my car. He lost my history, worse, and he should learn how to suffer now. They are going to catch me one day, or I'm just going to walk in and give them my story, calm as a bard of old. Then it will be over when I say it is. Maybe old Sheriff Boy could play the sheriff in the movie. I'd let him, I'd smile. Another way of his being mine." A local college-age boy walked right up to the table where Mortimer sat with his parents, who were almost asleep from the unusual big dinner. I know who you look like, but you'd have to be dead. Brother Dave Gardner. My dad played all his albums. Thought he was the funniest man in the world. Are you related? Get out of here with that. I don't like you this close to my face. You understand me? His parents awoke to this talk and were frightened. Ulrich had lost the dogs, or the dogs had lost him. The late spring air was too thick for him, and he worked, shouted, then stumbled toward the cool shade and ferned banks of green Trout Creek. Then he was a bit lost himself. His compass became stars as his lungs fought for air, and he blacked out before he could turn up the oxygen on the bottle at his waist. What was left of his lungs after the cigarettes smoked since the days of German jet airplanes when he revived, he wisely followed the creek toward the highway, but he wound up a mile west of the Raymond's house. He tried to call the dogs again but could make no sound. It was his intention that morning to give them a good forest run, then wash his favorite dog and give it to Mortimer. All his plans went bust now. The dogs never ran away from him of a sudden like this. Ulrich was very sick, staggering. He was terrified that ruthless deer hunters would kidnap his dogs for deer season next fall, then either shoot or abandon them, as they had done many times before. He knew all the dogs' names. He sent telepathy to them. Prayers, really. He knew he could not remain horrified much longer and live. He must get cool, take off clothes, get in the water, maybe strike his fist against his chest. They were smart dogs. He was the dummy. He had petted them too much. Then he thought he saw a woman in a flowery dress in an alley of tall grass. Almost a flag, and foreign. All his years came to right here. He began breathing again. Old man, who are you? Asked the woman's voice, unafraid, only curious. His sight was blurring, but he knew she would be a pleasant woman. Her hair would be black like the dress with flowers. She would be foreign to America but at ease. We smokers must be helpful to each other, she said, coming up. She held a long, lit Winston. I'm a pitiful lost man. Lost my dogs. Maybe my life running after them. He could not recall a personality for himself before the blackout. I need help, I think. It was Mimi Suarez. She was serene in her black flowered dress on a hot spring day, even in this veil of mosquitoes. Ulrich knew he was alive when her shoulders gave him pause, spilling ringlets to her clavicle. I think I might be dying, whispered Ulrich. As fatigue and repetition prepare men for death until they seek it, Ulrich felt a final tiredness. No pressing on, no other place. He sat down and all of his failures went past in a brief caravan beyond him. The woman rested with him on a stump where he sat with his oxygen bottle. He thought of the dogs again. He thought he heard them whimpering not far off. You decide, she suggested. Either go ahead or stay behind for others. My grandmother in Cuba, and still there, told me this once when I was a little girl with an awful disease, a high fever. Only a few pictures in my young head, and them already mixed with dreams of my future in the USA. I didn't know what they were, but here I am having them. The fever left, here I am. They both smelled something very sweet and bad, and they heard the dogs running and whining below an old pecan farm which had once had a mansion to go with it. Fever and then the depression finished it off. The pecans themselves were enormous. Up to the grove was beige wheat. They saw the dogs now, and Ulrich pulled himself up with Mimi's help, grasped his bottle. Got a bigger blast into his lungs. They made their way. This was where they found the little girl's t-shirt cut to shreds, thrown over human dung, lying on an anthill a foot high. Ants were all over it. The dogs were circling and very concerned, but they had not torn the shirt. They were circling, and it was plain they were in the deepest grief over the child's shirt. It is this place where Ulrich died. Little Irma, who had recently, during her flight, talked to the boys on Harvard's lawn. She knew she was pursued by Malcolm, but he was crippled and she did not think he would kill her once he caught her. She was starved, skinny and alone. Malcolm would not let her have her own suicide like Bertha's. She was on the way to becoming Bertha. She had come to the orphans' camp with suicidal urges, which she had acted on twice in Indianapolis when she had living parents. She stumbled upon the Allison boys in Harvard driveway busting up a long dead pecan limb for the simple reason that it was whole. She did not know where she was, but the house was so wide and nice with its pine-needled lawn that she thought it might be a church or a fort, and she dreamed of it as if it were in a book right before her. She had had friends who lived in such homes, but it seemed 2 eras ago. She was playing ping-pong in a garage of one in Indianapolis, and an old man came out of the house and said, "I see it now, child. You will become a medical missionary somewhere and be a great woman." He was the grandfather of the house, and she took him for mad and giggled along with her playmates, but now it seemed a deep saying and a future waiting on her if she could walk out of here now, away from Malcolm, who claimed to love her, him an old hairy man. He loved Irma, but it was Mimi Suarez he wanted, and her husband he wanted to exterminate. He was lost in waves of passion, driving him down a grey wall, like those motorcyclists in the velodromes at the state fair. The boys looked like they belonged here, and she was encouraged, even in her weakness. They were her age, native to this boondockery. The pines, the briars. She felt like a ruined hibiscus, the most exotic plant she knew. Stomped, gums bleeding, perhaps white around the mouth. "You an orphan?" Jacob asked her. "Yeah, I'm an orphan, a real orphan, on the move. Nobody stops me," Irma said. She almost fainted but smiled. "Are they after you?" "One man. I think I'm on my way to being a medical missionary." "You real skinny and pale. Well, get you a cola." "All right." Jacob went off to the house, and Harvard came out on the porch, but it was not clear he could make her out at this distance. A big old smooth yard. She sat on the lawn in a sweaty Big Mart t-shirt with a little cartoon girl and an enormous flower on it. This cartoon girl had big eyes. "I will work with tiny orphans like her on my shirt," thought Irma. There's so much I could tell her. Jacob returned with a cold wet towel, and she pressed it to her face and arms, then stomach. They watched her belly button with no apology. It was pretty, a deep tunneled shadow. She also had the buds of breasts in the cartoon shirt. It unsettled the boys, the idea of her, their age. They weren't ready to be like her. In fact, they were closer to infants. "You couldn't live here like us, but you could stay and play with the boat Doc Harvard made us for a while till they came got you. Eat some popcorn and get ice from the machine on the refrigerator," said Jacob. "No. I have to walk on." She was in a dream and taking care of foreign children in it. When she walked away, she had only enough energy to last for the mission. She believed health would rise in her as it had many times before. "I could begin with those boys. I will tell them about Jesus and Mary, how they are better than parents." Irma suddenly heard something after a mile in the woods. She wondered if there were great apes left in these thick woods, with its little alleys of sawgrass. Then she knew it was Malcolm thrashing toward her, a thing fighting its own sweat, tall, pink, stumbling, hair streaming. Irma knew he was coming from her dream mission in the foreign lands. She said to the thing, "Go ahead and eat me." "You notice anything new about me?" asked Malcolm. She took off. "You ran and made me mad," now panted Malcolm, covered in burrs and scratches. "You ain't got nothing but me now. You want to see my new moves." She ran as he was beset by an attack of diarrhea over an ant mound. Mortimer, all he did was look. Betsy had a book about Conway Twitty. This man had changed his name from something like Vernon to Conway Twitty, from the names of 2 ugly towns in Arkansas and Texas. Or because he had a sense of humor, but by his eyes she did not think so if photographs told the truth. He was a family man, upright, embarrassed by lewdness or even rumor, although he was sexy with his tunes, the writer wrote. Mortimer sat across the room watching the gigantic Japanese television while Betsy read. She tried to find Twitty in his bone structure. She did not think of this, but it was a strictly adolescent house they occupied, nothing but a few sticks of furniture and thick throw rugs and the giant screen television, sloppy at the base with mixed videos. Not a plant or even salt. Loaded with snacks and sodas. Otherwise a clean kitchen, no odor except the smell of manufacture. "I will tell your mother and father what you do with me," she said once. "You're not even going to see them. Don't be an idiot. You're not here against your will, some of it. I'm 13. Get back in the book. Nobody's hurt you. You and me, old man, are orphans from normal. Remember, but I can change. Stay quiet and you can be anything you want." "Well, see." A curious pause on the front porch of the bait store. Mortimer's yellow Lexus parked, no others. Dark clouds but not a speck of rain, only this deep shadow. Raymond and Roman could see Mortimer and Sydney at the counter inside peering into a glass-lidded case full of knives on velvet. They seemed at church. Not yet touching these treasures. See this little man, the high wavy bush of hair, the thin ankles in tasseled and buckled moccasins that seemed trimmed with actual coral snakeskin. Raymond and Roman had meant to buy supplies for crappy fishing on Harvard's launch, then have some talk of cancer, music, the history of Roman's Indian tribe, Jesus Christ as a man of the whip taking time to make it right there in the temple. Raymond had not known a black man since the days of Southern apartheid, although he called their names. The 50s. In Raymond's small town, there was a tiny college campus on which the faculty and students lived in three-storied Edwardian brick houses. The snow and then vicious ice had been on 3 days, a storm of the century for where they lived in southern Mississippi near the capital city. A professor's house caught fire. He was a veteran and had brought back live German rounds and weaponry in glass cases. It was not clear whether he just taught Nazis or taught them because he loved them, their flags, their helmets. Much of this ambiguity in the early 50s. The water pipes were frozen. Nothing to do but throw snowballs into the fire engulfing the professor's house. Then they saw the glass cases, and the bullets began exploding. 2 men were scraped, the crowd widened. A hopeless single fire truck, officious circles wringing their hands but having fun too. Germany rearing up on 3 stories and blowing its flak around. Raymond had no better memory. That evening of the fire and the booms and the thrilled citizens, a bullet of the ride could touch anybody. The professor might be in there, on fire and lecturing. What I am, thought Max Raymond suddenly, is an overprepared man. Here I am back at the burning place, where I keep returning ever since I was 11, Shiloh. Where man meets God, but the man has come too early and wearing the wrong things. I have suffered. If you are able to explain suffering, a man once told him, you weren't really there. Raymond stood ashamed before Mortimer, a bootlicker to a phantom. John Roman was also humiliated to meet his attacker. Getting shot was nothing like this. This little man had his number. "Hello, man," Roman said, surprising himself. He and Raymond watched Mortimer climbing down from the stool, ahead with his wig exempted from blame by a shape totally shifted into sickness. He might as well be a little girl, almost unbalanced by his large hair. Maybe he didn't remember Roman. Raymond and Roman moved off as Mortimer and Sydney laid hands on the glass. Eloquent hilts. Arcs and stilettos, a near sickle, smaller but heavy in the blade like a bolo. A sickness sat in the room, which they each seemed to have agreed not to discuss. Their faces blank, the men acted as though they had never met. Mortimer said something had to be done. These evil children were all over the place. Uptown, other towns. Some had been making nude movies, was the rumor. Nobody had much shame left. Mortimer smiled ear to ear. "I picked you up this tonic. Brings up the immune system," said the old boy at the herb store. "I'm feeling better for it myself. Feister. Heart's back in my projects," man said. "You ain't looking it. You boy. We ain't old yet." "I am, and sick as a dog," Sydney lied. He awoke nowadays with a fine mien on, but Sydney knew sickness. The way you could sink inside yourself and worship it. Shock them by your dilapidation yet refuse to fall. Mortimer's people had changed too. They were not as stupid as he thought. They had their own righteousness. They were no longer amazed by the excesses of his career. The SUVs, the strange empty homes, the small film production concern in Clinton. He knew they expected sin close to him. When he left for business, he saw pain in their looks. His old man was interested most in the junkyard, where he played quarter poker with Pedden. His man Pedden, in the shotgun house, whom Mortimer was allowing to live unmaimed. Pedden and Mr. Mortimer played cards and talked 50s automobiles. Mortimer tried to find his mother a hobby, but her eyesight was not good and she preferred silence. It bathed her, she said. She loved telling clean, pointless stories in which her struggles were the only memorable thing. Changing a tire on her own and finding a neighborhood dog nestled in with a family of coyotes. The old woman had insight too. When he brought little Irma past his folks at his SUV agency and told them she was the granddaughter of a client, Mrs. Mortimer's face went red. Still, she said they loved him and owed him for being stupid about his needs in Missouri. She agreed how a chicken yard in back could humiliate a boy who needed cars and girlfriends. How they went to church too much, expecting the pastor to correct all troubles straight from the pulpit, and how some of these pastors were fools who had barely entered life before they began announcing on it. She hugged Mortimer over and over now, commenting on his new white hair. He felt something for her and his father. It was intense, this feeling, a fresh one for him. Made him nervous and awkward around them. He gave aid needlessly, as out of a tube of charity inside his heart. He sat with them, saying nothing, 3 porch-bound elders watching for cars at the 4-way stop. At the house Mortimer finally had finished for them in Rolling Fork, they sat for 3 hours without a peep. Mortimer's new shoes the only true expression hereabouts. Penny loafers, black, the leather stamped with leaping trout. The house was plush leather furniture, gold and bright copper hardware set next to black for kitchen and bathroom fixtures, stinking of fiberglass and new wool on the floors. After the silence, while he was leaving, he said, "I'm happy we got all that cleared up." They laughed their first laugh together. Mortimer drove to Big Mart to buy his mother flowers for her sitting room, where she actually sat as if friends might arrive any second. He pulled up behind a man loading topsoil. Mortimer thought he recognized him, Bertha's nephew Ronnie, whose body shop he had used. The man did not know who Mortimer was, now in a Rolls Land Rover stolen in San Francisco. The man kept loading the topsoil in front of Mortimer's windshield, with his car door out in the passing lane. Mortimer could not move, yet he was practicing patience, thought, depth. Then he put his face out the window and asked, "Would you shut the door so I can get by, please?" A look of disgust crossed the man's face. Mortimer reached to his ashtray, put on his new ring. He had lately been interested in the concept of irony, how on the face of others it meant insult, such as Pepper had shown him before his beheading. The man had figured Mortimer to be a small irrelevance. This man closed the car door with that irony on his face. He was, after all, a busy foreman at the body shop now. Who was this skinny sissy with big hair in his tank of a car? Mortimer saw all this, then stopped his car in front of the man's. "Excuse me, sir. Would that be a look of irony on your face? Would you be giving me irony right now?" "Tire iron, you say no, I don't lend out." At this Mortimer's right hand flew up, and a ring-mounted razor swiped across the man's chin and lips, so there was an awful amount of blood. The man squalled through a dark mustache of it dripping over his hands, at his chin, his jowls. "It's the rudeness, man. Everywhere. And you worked for me, forgot me, let your real self loose on me out here." The man recognized him then. He was astounded by his thinness and wild high hair. Puny Italian sandals and no suitable beach sand for hundreds of miles. Ronnie watched for Mortimer's return and other strokes. Waited on the story of Mortimer's fury. He could not believe his own lips bore the tale pouring down his shirt front. He did not know why it had angered the man to find him ungiving about the tire iron. Mortimer walked in on Pedden and his father. They were paging through Pedden's file box of calendar art. Motorcycles or cars with women, lazing across a car hood, handlebars, a fender. On one a man's great tongue against thighs, scrawled there by a jokester. Worship of moving parts, combustion, bodies these two could covet. More than a spaceship or a moon landing, this local steel mesmerized them. No destination but the thing itself. They barely recognized Mortimer. I need meth to tide me over. To end the blues and the nasty world out there. You know how it is getting well, he began straight off. You at the wrong place. No meth for 3 years, Pedden told Mortimer. He looked at Mr. Mortimer's face. Even when I sold, you wouldn't find me at home doing it. Porn guy said you holding. That man is dead, the holding man, said Pedden. Pedden is now a Christian minister. He won't even touch a beer, said Mr. Mortimer. Man, you got to help me past this day. I might kill myself. Myself. Which pawnbroker? The guy, man. Tattoos. Civil War sabers, metal detectors. Who are you, asked Pedden. Simon. You know me. No I don't, said Pedden. Everybody knows me. So. I exist, man. Mr. Mortimer gathered himself to Pedden's side. You could be a demon to be dealt with by the Lord. He would know me. He would. But I don't. You'll have to forgive me. I don't. I believe I killed somebody, but it was in another country. God help you, you haven't gone anywhere, said Pedden. I exist, man, said Mortimer. I took you for somebody you're nothing like. Now I can't remember that person. You're the demon itself. I've seen them before, and you too, said Pedden. Pedden looked at Mr. Mortimer, the father, who had made a noise. He was actually squirming, lost in humiliation. It had been 30 years since he had reckoned on the fact his son might be an absence, or all things present at once. Against the chickens in the back window he had watched the profile of the boy and comprehended him as a dangerous nullity, although he could not have voiced this. He knew only that he had been frightened and should be dying of shame. Egan approached the orphans' camp slowly. He had the dogs in the car. Ulrich's death had nearly broken him, and he thought what he would find at the camp might do the rest of the job. The camp was strangely silent, and marks of destruction were everywhere. 2 dead orphans were floating near the bridge to the northern entrance, shot at close range in the head. Trembling, Egan left the dogs in the car and crossed the bridge. Exploring the grounds, he saw no one, though he thought some orphans might be hiding in one of the buildings. Finally old Pete Wren waved to him and came out of the assembly hall. He was living at the camp lately as a counselor emeritus, had worn a bathrobe during the whole catastrophe. He told Egan everything had started because of some new arrivals, 2 big black inmates from Norfolk, Virginia, and Patterson, New Jersey, and a white boy from South Mississippi who had made himself an orphan, who had killed his own father after watching his mother die of alcoholism, but was exonerated. Wren seemed curiously calm but wouldn't stop the irrelevancies, Egan thought. I came over because I was inspired by the church services held by you and Pedden that woke up a thing in me to act, to do some good in my old age, because I stole my cousin's good name. It felt good to drive here and be taken right in. I slept the best sleeps I had slept in years on my hard simple cot. There weren't many rules. Before long, I began to find out there might not be any rules. Jean or Penny were always talking about love and trust at the center of the universe and how vigilant we should be against the old world, as they called it, but the children didn't seem to listen. They also seemed to have sex a lot and about where they wanted it, fairly loudly and known to the children, and I could not, for the life of me, decide the lesson in this because it did not appear purely natural man and wife devotion, but a sort of schedule thing like a cup of coffee. They said they had been instructed by the ultimate pain of the bad life they'd had before now. Then the orphans gathered and all moved into the main building one night. They said they weren't Oasis anymore. They were ataxes, which spelled attack and from an axis of high consciousness about children or something like that. A new bad spirit was into them, little and big, led by those black boys and the boy who'd killed his father. Somebody took a random shot at Jean and Penny trying to start a sing-along. I thought the shot was a firecracker at first. The big boys said they had learned things about who was the enemy and they were getting down serious to it. Everybody on the other side of the lake was bad. They had been using the girls and enslaving them, then turning them away when they were hurt and no good to them anymore. Jean and Penny had to know about this and didn't tell them. One of the black boys, the one from Patterson, put a pistol right in Malcolm's face and kept it there. The smaller rough boy told him to sit in the chair. True, I have had my lifetime of trouble with black boys and men. They were rude, sassy, out-of-way tricky when a straight yes or no would do. Had all the tricks, especially for old white men, because I guess they want up on the old colonel of the plantation. Rumid can't take care of himself, looking for somebody to open the door for him. But a cigarette, is that too much to ask when they have a box in their pocket? Then you say you don't have a light, and they push out a dead lighter to you so you're lighting your cigarette, but it's dead. These guys are rigged for whites like that when they're 15. Do they learn this at the knee of somebody, or at church, or special powered groups? They'll go to prison and they come out with more cigarette tricks and are losing the war every day. Minister Farrakhan, can't he do something? They need love even with